Welcome back to pixelprojectradio. This is part 2 of our critical analysis of Pentiment. If you found this episode before finding part 1, please do go back and check that out. We are going to dive right into it today. And by we, of course, I mean not just me, because that's not what that pronoun means. I'm here with Nick from Friday Night Gamecast, who joined me on part 1. Nick, how's it going?
It's going great, Rick. Happy to be back here to finish up the story and to unravel the annals of history with you.
Yeah, I'm really pleased that we're doing this game. I really can't wait to get into the rest of this story. We stopped last time at kind of a weird spot. That's just how time ended up working in our favor that on that evening. But we ended right before going into the St. John's Feast in Act 2, right after Andreas's dream. Again, it was a bit of a weird spot to end. That is one of my favorite scenes in this entire game, where we first get to see Beatrice transform into Melancholia, and we start to see the inner workings of Andreas's mind sort of change and shift. And, since that first recording that we did, a little peek behind the curtain is it's been about a week and a half, 2 weeks-ish since we recorded. I went back and rewatched one of the Josh Sawyer interviews, and I wanted to preface with 2 things that he mentioned here. The first is about the layouts of the Mind Palace. So as we go through Andreas's Mind Palace, it begins in a certain way, and then it starts to kind of shift as we go on. And there are 3 sort of acts to it that kind of correspond with the 3 acts of the game, roughly. The first one is the one that we saw in part 1, where Socrates is there, Prester John, Beatrice, I don't actually, it's Divine Comedy, it's probably Beatrice, and Saint Grobian. When we're in there that time, the Mind Palace isn't so much as a maze or a labyrinth as it's a sort of Italian divine city where you can approach the center from any direction and you can get there all the same. Did you notice this when you were playing through? Like, you could go through any side and get to the center no matter what.
Yeah, I did notice that. I thought it was interesting, especially because of where his mind space was at this point in time. Yeah, the kind of the changing of his memory palace and the city of dreams, as well as just like the reflection of what Melancholia / Beatrice looks like, I think is really indicative of obviously what Andreas is going through at that time, where he's at in his life. And I know that the labyrinth is very significant to reflect like what's going on within his inner workings, but I didn't really put the 2 and 2 together to realize that you can get to the center by any means necessary. I thought that's cool.
And speaking of the labyrinth, getting to the center by any means, by any side, kind of represents this feeling of order, symmetricality, somebody that is at peace, at oneness with themselves. When it transmogrifies, I don't know. Whenever it transforms into the labyrinth, it's interesting because then there is only one path to the center with some branching dead ends. And Josh Sawyer in his talk about this explains that labyrinths in Christian mythos, and there's another paper that I think I'll include in the sources too, are used as a sort of meditative process. There is only one path forward, and you go through it as a meditation to find Christ and to become one with yourself, to feel that sense of oneness, that wholeness through, the Lord Jesus Christ or the Lord God, depending on whether you're Catholic, Christian, whatever. Right. And now we're switching to that with Andreas, but I think it's interesting that we get to that from the perfect city, the symmetrical city, because while it is a meditative process, it does suggest a sort of back step, right? And we see that, like you said, Nick, through Andreas's mental shift. This Act 2, whenever this labyrinth becomes a labyrinth, which is different than a maze, those aren't the same thing. When it becomes that, this is where Andreas starts to just vocally express that he's fallen out of love with art, right? Yeah. He has lost his muse. He's lost a piece of himself. His identity is functionally gone. He's lost. And, presumably if he can get to the center of that inner labyrinth, he will find himself. But we don't know if that's the case because we haven't got there yet.
Right.
It's brilliant. I'm such a fan of all of the little touches that Josh Sawyer and his team did. And it was a team. He in that talk, he made a point to say, like, his degree is, quote, a baby degree, is how he said it, a bachelor's degree.
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, I hired and consulted with professionals. So I just love this game so much. I apologize for rambling so much at the front end, but it's just a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, it is so good. And it's like, back to what you were saying, obviously the three acts of Pentiment, kind of are symbolic of like multiple things, whether you want to look at it from the Christian lens with the Holy Trinity or just like the three chapters of the lives of the people that, are in Tassing at this point in time. I think that like, specifically to just circle back and, the conclusive thoughts on like the changing of the labyrinth over time, I think that the first depiction of the labyrinth on being able to enter it from any angle or from any side of the labyrinth to get to the center, in like this idea of like becoming one with God, becoming like one with Christ, or just like becoming one with yourself, is really indicative of like Andreas's innocence and his lack of knowledge on so many fronts. Either his lack of knowledge on like what the people in Tassing are actually like or about, but then also like his lack of, I guess, I don't know, maybe his lack of just like weathered experience, like the world hasn't had a chance to beat him down quite yet. And I think that is so interesting to think about, like he's able to be one with himself because of his ignorance. However, you see him come back in Act 2, and already, even though he's considered a master by everyone in his field, he even has himself an apprentice in Caspar. He's just a deeply unhappy person because of the way that his life has panned out, and he's so disillusioned. This changing of the labyrinth in his mind palace like completely makes sense to me. So yeah, the little touches are kind of like that's the credit to this game, and that's really what it's all about.
We'll see more with the labyrinth towards the end, a little farther into the story. There is one more thing that I wanted to bring up here, and I really wish I would have remembered to write this down and bring it up at the beginning of the first episode. But there's a quote that Josh Sawyer mentions where he was talking in his talk about all of the high ideas that he wanted to put into this game. And one of them is this quote: "History is neither fact nor truth, but what people left behind."
Yep.
History is neither fact nor truth, but what people left behind. That is such a profound quote. And I want to put a challenge to the listeners to keep that in mind as we go through here. This squares directly into the theme of Pentimento, right? This idea of painting over history, and the people in power, the quote-unquote winners, get to pen history, right?
Yep, exactly.
This is so interesting because Josh will go on to speak about this, and he says that history is by nature an incredibly fragile thing, right? Because the people that pen history, the people that write it down for the next generations, they, one, are writing from a place of bias at all times. Nobody can write unbiased. It's almost impossible.
Yep.
So not only that, there's also interpretations. Human memory is not infallible. Humans are not infallible. There will be some sort of interpretation, personal interpretation. There's also the cultural interpretation. And then after all of that is written down, I think what Josh says is like 80% of it is lost to time, just completely lost. So that leaves us in the future with this monumental task of looking at this very nebulous and murky thing that we see as history. And it's not as easy as just saying history is fact. Well, this is what the history books says, so it must be true. Think back to learning one sentence or two about Malcolm X in, United States elementary or middle school history class. That's not history, right? That's not necessarily true. And here it's even different because, like, looking back to Malcolm X or, 2024 to the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, we're in a cultural lens where we can interpret that pretty accurately. But whenever we go back over 100 years, when we go back over 500 years, suddenly there is such a displacement of sociological and anthropological norms and ideals that it becomes much more challenging to view things in the way that they were meant to be viewed. And this quote just slapped me in the face whenever he said it. I think it's brilliant. It's a beautiful quote. And I want everybody to keep this in mind as we go through, because it does play a key role into the end of the story.
Absolutely. I couldn't add any more to what you've said there, Rick. It's one of those things where when we're thinking about Pentiment and we're looking at what has been left behind, as you know, as you've previously mentioned, we have less primary documentation of what existed then, because access to education and writing and records was limited to mostly the people within the church. And obviously the church, very much, holds those records and maintains those records to this day. And so it's, historians' job to interpret over the course of time. But yeah, it's 100%. It's a beautiful part of this game, and I am so glad that I get the chance to kind of pick apart with you today here and get to play armchair historian.
Well, let's not keep anybody waiting. Let's keep going in. Let's sit down into our comfy armchairs and keep going through the narrative. So we wake up from our dream as Andreas, and we're heading out to find Caspar. We went to bed early. Caspar asked if he could stay out during St. John's Eve. We say yes, because, we're being nice to Caspar in this playthrough. Mm-hmm. When we go out, all of the townsfolk are in their costumes of St. John's Eve. You can't really tell who is who. They're sort of dressed up. Those pagan traditions are still kind of coming through. Father Gernot is out here too. He's furious. What we mentioned last time, he is imposing harsher taxes and rules onto the townsfolk and the peasants. Nobody is allowed in the forest, he says. He'll excommunicate anybody. We run into him out here. We hear a scream after we find Caspar. It's the three of us, an unlikely trio. And we go to check out this scream. And when we get into the town, Otto has been murdered. There's a second murder.
Which is crazy.
It is crazy. I'm sure that I can speak for you here. Whenever we hear Otto in the beginning sort of rallying the troops, rallying the townsfolk, saying that God is on their side and he has proof, we kind of saw this coming.
Yeah. He's being a little bit of a troublemaker. He's being a little bit of a rabble rouser. It's definitely kind of written on the wall at this point.
At this point, the townsfolk are much quicker to anger than they were in Act 1. They're out for blood almost immediately. They accuse Gernot, and we're like, he couldn't have been him. He was with us, and they basically tell us to can it, and they chase us to the Abbey. A huge chase ensues, led by Peter predominantly. He is going to be a key figure in this. And they chase us to the Abbey. They kind of corner the monks and the brothers into the library, and they set up an ultimatum. They say, it's either you or you give us who killed Otto. Mm-hmm. If you can't prove it, it's all of you. Peter is not messing around this time.
And this is really important, obviously, to set up the precedent. You hit this moment, and once again, you find Andreas, now with his apprentice Caspar, put into a situation where they're the de facto investigators. It's exactly like the what had happened before. Andreas has a lot of love for the Abbey. He has a lot of nostalgia for the Abbey. He came back to Tassing to try and reclaim some of his, maybe reclaim some of his spirit, reclaim some of his just like overall lust for life. And then now he's faced with yet another situation that's exactly the same as before. Not only are these suspicions coming back, not only is he realizing the thread puller is kind of at play again here, but he obviously has this conviction that he wants to help the Abbey. He wants to help the brothers, obviously, because it's like not out of any love for Father Gernot, but love for what the Abbey and what Tassing meant to him at that time. So I thought this was cool, but especially because of the fact that you realize that the townsfolk have been pushed to the breaking point, and this is what the result is now.
Exactly so. This is going to see us doing another investigation just like Act 1. So just like Act 1, we're not going to go through every single bit of information and every single person we talk to, but we're going to sort of go over it from a bird's eye view, a bigger picture, and talk about what we did and what avenues we found interesting. So in this act, there are 3 primary suspects. There is Brother Guy. He can be a suspect. Hannah at the new inn, the Golden Hand Inn, is a suspect. And Martin Bauer. These are our primary 3 suspects here. So, what were some interesting tidbits of information or scenes that you came across during this section?
So obviously the conversations that you have, like, I hated Brother Guy from the beginning. Like, obviously, like, I was not fond of this person, but talking to him and interfacing with him was pretty peculiar in terms of like me trying to firmly put him in a place of like, okay, yes, clearly he has done something wrong here, right? And so the thing is that there are situations where obviously he was in the church previously, and I can't remember specifically what his evidence is, but also you learned that Guy has been responsible for grifting off the top. And honestly, compared to obviously the three primary main suspects, Hannah, Martin, and Guy, like I didn't want to blame Hannah in this situation. Obviously, she has the capacity, maybe, and maybe the motivations to actually do some of the do the murder here, but Brother Guy was such an unlikable character that every single interaction with him, both in Act 1 as well as in Act 2, as Andreas, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna do it. I'm sorry. Like I had him pinned from the point there, and then the rest of my conversations throughout Act 2 was like, all right, well, let me see if I can try to pull any other information on any of these other suspects to determine whether or not this is going to be a situation that's going to add up to me kind of leaning away from Guy, since my mind was already made up, but I couldn't find anything that was compelling enough.
Yeah, so Brother Guy, I don't quite remember how he becomes a primary suspect, like how it first comes up. Hannah and Martin, they're both at the town rally that Otto is holding, and Hannah is not very quick to side with the townsfolk. It's pretty clear that she is kind of against this revolt, and she's a newcomer in town, which makes her a little doubly suspicious, right? This is a small town. I don't know about you, but I grew up in a very small town, and people are not trustworthy of newcomers, almost regardless of anything else. They are distrustworthy to those that aren't their own. Martin, it's kind of the opposite. He's very, very supportive at the town at the town square, and people are kind of like, he wasn't this way before. All of a sudden, he's super supportive, and like, what's his deal? He kind of did a 180. He's almost like a new man these past few years. Yeah. So that's why he's in suspicion. Going back to Brother Guy for a second, did you explore his storyline about him being Jewish?
I didn't explore it. I do remember that coming up though, and it being very interesting to me about the fact that he was not originally Christian. I don't know if what was the. Do you know what was like the end point of that, like how that came to be?
I don't know that I explored it to fruition, but the gist of it is, at this time, Jews were still being persecuted. Like, they were not looked upon kindly, especially not by the Catholic Church. And I don't exactly know where it ends up, but he becomes not a sympathetic character, but he's not the cold-blooded asshole that he is kind of painted to be. He does have a side to him that's like, I feel kind of bad for him.
Yeah, definitely agreed. That's what they typically do with all of these characters. Even Lucky in the first act, even though like I didn't blame Lucky, I've heard people argue that he was, because of how he reacts at his execution or some of the line deliveries that he has, and his access to blunt objects, everything that kind of involves, it kind of seems as though Lucky fits the place as the murderer in the first case. But that's the beautiful thing about these investigations, is that there is no right answer. Any of the people could be responsible, but like they always do this towards the end, where it's like, you've made up your mind, you've pieced together the evidence, you want to present this, and you want to place blame at the individual that you think is most responsible for the murder or most suspicious. And then like you always see kind of at the tail end, there's notes or there's interactions or there's conversations that you have with them. You're like, damn, really? Why did you have to tell me that? Because I was so convinced. And yeah, I definitely remember Brother Guy. It's like, I was convinced with him at a certain point, especially with the embezzling, the fact that he and Otto had no love lost between the two of them. And it's just, yeah. Hey, I thought it was fascinating. I completely glazed over the fact that he was formerly Jewish, though.
This wraps up in a really cool. I love how this wraps up in the last act too. That's the only information that I got on Brother Guy in this playthrough was that he was embezzling. You learn that through talking with Sister Amelie, actually, after a scene that we'll probably talk about in a minute. She confirms this. This is why the Abbey is sort of, they're both raising taxes to an extreme degree, and they're kind of worrying for their own pocketbooks. They don't have enough to survive, and it's because Guy is skimming off the top. And Otto knew this. At one point, he saw him writing, and he demanded to see in the ledger, and Guy said no. And this Otto knew, so that kind of puts the evidence onto Brother Guy.
Mm-hmm.
I actually, I'll spoil it a little bit. I implicated Martin in this playthrough. I wanted to implicate Hannah, but I couldn't get enough evidence.
Oh wow, okay.
Let's talk about a scene that I hope you did as well as I. The first thing that I did was go to the inn and buy everybody a pint. We're having a party.
This is a really good one.
This is such a cool scene. You go to the inn, and the idea is if you buy everybody around, you're going to take everybody's mind off the murder, and you're going to loosen some lips. You're using that social lubricant to get some information out of people. And you can talk to so many people here. The first people that I talked to up top were Werner and his Italian doctor friends. And because I had a background in Latin, they all speak Latin, and they hear me, they hear Andreas speak it, and they're like, oh yeah, we could all switch to Latin. So I was able to have this conversation with them for the first time. On previous playthroughs, there was always one person that I couldn't understand, and there had to be a translator. At the very end, Werner can give you information. I forget on what, but he can give you some information that he has. But he hated my guts on this playthrough so fucking much that he just told me to go to hell, and he wouldn't talk to me.
Yeah, no, I remember this and going through there and talking to everybody simultaneously. And Werner, I didn't even bother with Werner because he and his I don't think I had a background in Latin, and he obviously was confrontational with me with some of his Italian doctor friends. What I did do though was play cards with Samuel, and I'm very curious as to how this panned out with you.
Dude, I don't know. I couldn't tell you how to play this card game. It's called Lansquenet. Yeah. I couldn't tell you how to play it. I just kept betting everything, all in, and I eventually ended up winning everybody's money, and I got I got an achievement for it. Caspar loves you for it. It's it's crazy. It's so funny. I just saw a meme the other day of this person was like, yeah, we had a contest to build a robot to play poker, and whoever's robot won, would win prize money. And this kid was like, I ended up winning because I programmed it to be, if my turn, bet all in, and everybody else just folded every time. And I was like, that's my strategy, just all in, all in, all in, and I eventually won.
Oh, that's hilarious, because I was trying to play the numbers game. I was trying to do, I was trying to get this achievement because I knew this was the achievement on the list, and I was like, oh no, this sounds so fun. So I was trying to actually take it seriously. I looked up the true achievements guide to doing this, and I still fucking lost. It was so funny. I was like, all right, that's fine. I have to keep moving. I have to finish this act.
You can learn a couple things here. Samuel is a traveling mercenary. I don't remember exactly what their title is. But, he travels for coin, and, they fight, and he talks about how dangerous
Italian,
it is.
Right?
Yes, I think.
I can't. Yeah, I just remember the conversations that you have with him, and he talks about his travels, and Caspar is very much interested in the stories that he has of, being a traveling mercenary and stuff. That was very cool.
Yeah, and Samuel's like, you wanna join? And Andreas is like, the kid's an artist, man. He's not gonna fight.
Yeah.
What are you doing? The other key thing that I learned here, which I thought would be evidence, but it's not. You learn that Hannah spends a lot of time at the rat house.
Okay. Wait, the rat is that how to pronounce it? It's not Rathaus?
I mean, I see house, how it's spelled, Haus, and I think German. Right. So I just go rat house.
No, that makes sense.
I don't know. After a while, a bar fight will break out here because of Martin. Martin, you can learn this during St. John's Eve. He has a tendency to get a little drunk during parties, and he gets drunk here. And one of the it's pretty funny. One of the doctors bumps into him, and Martin's like, "Hey, watch where you're going," because he's Boston all of a sudden. Yeah. And the doctor will be like, "Scusi," and Martin will be like, "You speak German, you son of a bitch," and he just starts throwing hands. It's pretty good. I'm not even like I'm exaggerating a little bit, but only a little. That's basically what happens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, it's great, and this humor is consistent throughout. the course of the game, in terms of like it becomes like it goes from like dry wit situations to like very funny caricatures of individuals to, obviously Martin in the first act kicking Andreas in the shins and saying eat shit before running off, to like stuff like this that's absolutely absurd, people just getting sloshed and throwing hands in a bar. It's great.
You can try to talk people down. You can calm them down, and depending on how you try to talk people down, and depending on some of the things you say to the travelers that are in the inn, you can learn, if you were kind to one particular group of travelers, and if you calmed everybody down, if you passed the checks, you'll learn that this guy is like, this Martin guy, he looks exactly like this fella that I knew from long ago named Jobst.
Yep.
Jobst. It's like he's a dead ringer, and he disappeared from town one night, never to be seen again after he killed a man. And Andreas is like, when was this? And he's like, it was this many years ago. And he's like, that's exactly when people say Martin came back to town. And this is where this is more or less where you almost definitively learn that Martin is an imposter. What ended up happening was, and you can confront him about this and he'll tell you everything.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, when Martin left, we ran off after stealing the Baron's stuff. He got killed on the road. And this guy, I can't remember if this guy, Jobst, was his partner or he just happened across them. But either way, he lived on the road for a while as a thief. And then he saw Martin dead and he came back to town. He came back and stole his identity to live out here, to live a new life.
Yeah, and it's great because obviously he comes back, and it's so ironic, the fact that he, all of the townsfolk who don't realize that this isn't actually Martin, it's just somebody who looks just like him. I think that maybe his family, his mom, I can't remember her name specifically, but I just remember the conversation with her about Martin changing so much and him completely having a new chapter on life and turning around and being helpful to the community, being kind to his family, being kind to his wife, being a contributing, gainful member of this little town.
He has a crazy tell. Did you catch this really minor thing that you can pick up on?
No. What was this?
So in Act 1, anytime he walks by these wildflowers, he'll sneeze. And in this act, he doesn't. And there's
they're picking wildflowers outside his home, right?
Exactly. And in the beginning of Act 2, Andreas will see him, and if you're clicking too fast through the choices, you'll miss it. But Andreas will have a thought, and it'll be like, I thought Martin was allergic to these flowers. And other people, one or two other folks will pick up on it too. And if you confront him about it, this is something you bring up. You're like, you're not allergic anymore. And that's when he's kind of like, oh shit, the jig is up.
Yeah.
That is so cool. I only caught that on a second and third playthrough, but it's such a cool little detail.
Yeah, that is so interesting. That's just so neat. I love that part.
But that's, you can put the blame on Martin for this alone. Or you can keep his secret. It's really up to you.
For the fact that he's not who he says he is. I kept his secret, and I don't know what your perspective is on this, but like I kept it secret just because he was a nice guy. I was like, you're doing well for this community. You're obviously making everybody in the real Martin's family much happier than the real Martin actually did. And I think that his theme of coming in and taking the identity of the old Martin, but actually doing something good with it, or just being a good person in general, was really powerful to the overall story. So I was like, you know what, I'm not gonna blame him. I don't know. I think you said you implicated him?
I implicated him just because I couldn't implicate Hannah, but but Martin's character arc it's got a beautiful sub theme of what does forgiveness mean and what does that look like. This guy was a delinquent. He was a thief, and he was living on the road. And after he witnessed death and how awful death can be, he came here, and yes, he did steal somebody's identity, but that caused him to turn his life around. And he said, I'm on the straight and narrow from here on out. I am changing my ways, and I will be a good to my community. And he is, like you said. I think after you find out, you can tell his wife, Brigitte, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell her, like, hey, this isn't Martin. And essentially she's like,
I don't care.
I don't care. He's a good man. He's a good father. He does so much more to this community than the original Martin ever did. He may as well. I mean, he is Martin in all ways but name. What something a rose can smell as sweet. I think Josh Sawyer said that originally, right?
Yeah.
This is, it's kind of the Paul is dead theory. Even if that is Billy Shears and the Beatles, he still did everything that quote unquote Paul did. So he may as well be Paul, right?
Right.
Paul's not dead, everybody. I'm just being silly, but it's such an interesting thing. Like, what does it mean to seek true forgiveness, and how ready are you to accept it if it's somebody else seeking it?
Yeah, that's true.
It's beautiful.
I think it's really beautiful, and it's also indicative of how Andreas perceives a lot of the other town members. And of course, Andreas is the lens of the player, so you have a lot of option, you have a lot of choice on how you want to perceive the character arcs of all of the individual town members, whether it is Otto or Father Thomas, or some of these other characters that you're going to come up later on in the game, even Lindhart. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I thought it was a really beautiful moment of the second act.
Lenhart is the one that I don't think I could find any sort of compassion for.
Mm-hmm.
He is just such an asshole. It's especially with one of the you can have a meal with him during this act that I didn't write down, but I think we could talk about. The last piece of evidence that I wanted to bring up, though, was the confessions. Did you do this?
I don't remember, honestly. It's just been so far from Act 2 that I couldn't remember if I did or not.
Oh, that's okay.
Is this where you go into the church and you can listen to the people confessing to Father Thomas?
Yeah.
Okay, I did do that. Just kidding. Yeah.
Awesome.
No. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're fine. This is such a cool act because you can only listen to two people, but you don't have to listen to the same two people on every run. You can choose to ignore some people. It's really cool. So Caspar will suggest you're thinking like, who can we go to that might know something? And I think it's Caspar that says, there's a confessional. We can listen to Father Thomas, listening to the sins. For those that maybe didn't grow up Catholic, confession for modern day Catholicism involves one person going into the confessional. The priest is sitting on the other side of the confessional. There's like this divider where you can't really see the priest. Like there's a little, usually there's like some kind of like a mesh hole.
It's like lattice or something like
that.
Yeah,
yeah. Like you could peek into it, but if it's meant to encourage privacy. And it's just you and the priest, and you confess your sins, and they'll absolve you of your sins. Here, it's that same process, but it's just in an open room, so everybody can kind of hear everybody's business. Mm-hmm. This is just small town to the extreme, where everybody just knows everything about each other for all the goods and ills that brings.
Yeah.
It's really funny, but you can go in and listen to these confessions with Father Thomas. And this is great. This is how you learn at the very end. You can speak to Sister Amelie, and she'll tell you about Brother Guy. This is where, so here I chose to listen to, I listened to Paul, who is Lenhart's son, and he kind of complains about, Dad won't let me draw, and I think that's bullshit. And Father Thomas will say, well, you must respect your father. And then he's like, I've had impure thoughts about a girl. And he's like, how many times? And he's like, I couldn't even tell you, man.
Yeah, it's great.
And what's funny is Father Thomas is a little more lenient on that. He's like, that's natural, but, just say your prayers, stick to Jesus, that kind of thing. But you can learn here, I think, from Anna that she stole a letter from Martin, as well as, I think, Historia I might be wrong on that. But the main things that I learned here, I learned that Lennart and some woman are hooking up. I think you can kind of infer that it's Hannah.
It's so Hannah, yeah.
She's married to Nico at the inn. She's hooking up with Lennart. I chose here to listen to Agnes, and because I had murdered Lucky, I had got Lucky murdered, that was a slip, in the last act, she fucking hates Andreas. She straight up tells Father Thomas, like, I don't think even with the grace of God I can ever forgive this man. He took everything from me.
Yep.
She hates you.
Justifiably so. And that's another powerful, reason, or just another powerful characterization of like how these characters are written just so multidimensionally, right? Because they're not forgiving. They're not forgetting what's happened in Act 1. They bring everything, all of that trauma, they bring all of that history forward with them in Act 2. And it's, that's really interesting. I'm honestly, there's another piece to that where it's like, I'm glad that I didn't kill Lucky because of like what he represents to the community. But that's very interesting, being able to observe that. Yeah,
it really is. This is, you live in your choices in this game, and it's part of what makes it so special. Andreas will then confess at the very end too. What I love about this, I missed I wanted to write down something he said. I missed it, so I looked up a playthrough, and it turns out that this really good line, he doesn't say it if you chose a different path, but I went back and found a playthrough that chose my exact path, like Latin, wherever I had traveled to. It took a minute, but I found it. Andreas will talk openly about, falling out of love with art. He says he dreads going back to Nuremberg. His commissions are all pomp and vanity, monuments to the powerful as they want to be seen. I really resonate with Andreas's arc of falling out of love with your passion. As somebody that went through that with music, after leaving the field, developing focal dystonia, and essentially having to step away from my career whether I wanted to or not. Well, okay, I didn't actually have to, but it was a complicated choice with several factors involved. Too much to get into on this podcast. Sorry for the diversion. But anyway, you feel a piece of yourself die, and it's akin to looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger. It's a quiet kind of unsettling. If you, sorry, I don't want to bring the podcast down. What's interesting here is that when you say this, Father Thomas will say, you'll tell him that you're feeling lost and hopeless. And Father Thomas will say that hopelessness offends God because through Christ, salvation is possible. I'm bringing some of my own past to this, but these platitudes from Catholicism specifically always really frustrated me. I have a lot of friends these days that work in the church that are very religious, and different sects of Christianity, like I'm not going to try and list them. I don't actually remember what Ben is off the top of my head, Episcopalian maybe, but they're a little less strict and rigid in their rulings. But this, through Christ's salvation is possible, so feeling hopelessness is kind of an affront to God, is something that I heard a lot as a child, and it really rubs me the wrong way. I don't think that's conducive to a healthy religious outlook.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Greg.
Are you ready to go on record? Are you ready to go on record for all your religious views? You ready? Here we go.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's what's actually most interesting. Obviously, growing up in a very agnostic atheist household with my parents, I always have found history, or media that is steeped in religious history to be supremely fascinating to me, especially because I can look at it through the lens of distance, right? I have distance away from that. So it's not something that is going to hurt me or be as close to home as I would, as maybe somebody who was raised in the church, or somebody who has direct interactions with people in the church. That kind of also dilutes a little bit of, my own personal bias or my own personal touch to forms of media that have Christianity with them. But I think that, Rick, that's a super powerful kind of place to go with this. And it's a very interesting thing to see in this game, something that you have gone through personally. Obviously growing up in the South, North Carolina, being around folks who are very judgmental and very open about their religious views, is unavoidable, right? And so it is unavoidable. And I think that I have heard something very close to what Father Thomas is kind of relaying to Andreas, myself multiple times in real life. And so I think it's just like, it's one of these things that's like, it's a saying that is something that people in a powerful religious position want to use in order to kind of motivate blind faith. And I think that is something that is incredibly detrimental, and you see the negative effects of what blind faith has on the people within Tassing, even on the abbots within the Abbey Kearsarge. So it's this idea that, through God, anything is possible. Therefore, hopelessness is antithetical to the idea of being godly or worshiping God in this sense. I obviously find that can be probably very triggering, and it's completely unhelpful to Andreas, because I don't think that anything that he has, obviously, his what he's saying about the fact that his art has been distorted by the fact that he has to work for the rich and powerful in order to make a living. This is very much coming from an environmental functionalism standpoint. Like, he's dealing with the realities of what has played out in his life and why he feels trapped. He feels trapped because of the woman he had married. He feels trapped because of what he's had to do in his own career. And then now he's being told, well, don't worry, God's got you. Don't worry about it, right? Like, that's unhelpful to him in every sense of the imagination. So yeah, it's powerful. And I think it is important to point this out.
It comes down to how that faith is nurtured, right? Yeah. Whereas this version of Catholicism, I'm not even going to say modern Catholicism. I can't speak to that. But this version here, and the version that I grew up with, is we nurture faith through fear and guilt, and you better stay on the path or else. Whereas a more understanding sect of the Christian faith could say, you're feeling lost, let's get you back on track via your faith, through God. Maybe through God you can find yourself. Maybe finding yourself will lead you to God. Yeah. Not, you are lost, and because you are lost, you are slapping God in the face. That is what I really resent here, and it's really frustrating. I don't want to drag this podcast out for like 3.5-4 hours, but it is such an accurate representation to old school Catholicism that you still, like, when I was in elementary school, I went to religious classes every week. I think they call them CCD, and they were taught by these two old nuns, Sister Donatella and Sister starts with an A. I don't think it's Anastasia, Sister Anastasia and Sister Donatella. Mm-hmm. And they were like nuns in their 70s, and they were very old school Catholic. And I heard a lot of these things. I got in a shitload of trouble once for coloring a picture of Jesus green because I was just being creative, and I got in a lot of trouble for that. Wow. It was crazy. But yeah, this old school version of Catholicism, not modern day. I'm not trying to attack anybody for their faith, but I have a lot of personal issues with this. So it's really interesting to see a secular artist like Andreas going through, secular meaning not of the church. Like, not a lot of people were atheists back then, except for Voxlov, apparently. Yeah. Anyway, I apologize, man. I'm not trying to drag this podcast out for like hours and hours and hours.
No.
I'm also not trying to hog the mic, so please, like, take it from me if you want.
Yeah, I just think this is so directly relevant to so many of the themes in the game. And obviously, we've talked at length in the first part of this show about how your interpretation of religion and religious aspects of what Andreas has to go through throughout the course of his journey, and how that impacts him. I think that, like, obviously your relationship to God, or to, the modern interpretations of God, and, whatever religious Christian sects that you ascribe to, I think that, like, everything is valid and everyone is valid. But I think that specifically when you look at the Holy Roman Empire and how things are changing and why things had to change and why Martin Luther was such an important historical figure at this point in time, and how that impacts, obviously, him coming up in the first act, and the fact that, it's a point of conversation between Andreas and Father Guerneau, who absolutely wants to shut it down. Like, it's, the point of religious fanaticism in this game is played out in multiple moments. And I think that Father Tomas is obviously painting this picture for you here, of where he stands, of where he sits with it, and I think that obviously in this moment where Andreas is talking to Father Thomas about, obviously his confessing his sins and confessing, where he's at in life. It's beautiful on multiple fronts because, like, he's not, again, to reiterate, approaching this from a Christian lens. He's approaching this from very much a based, realist, secular lens of, like, I'm struggling with my life. I'm depressed. They didn't have a word for depression back then, but, I'm going through the melancholia, or I'm experiencing the melancholia, and that this is a result of all of these choices of what is happening to me in the world and in life right now, and why the world feels like it's closing in around him. And I also think that that's one of the reasons why he loves this investigation, or like why he keeps falling into these positions where he'll just take the investigation upon himself. because
it keeps him busy.
It keeps him busy, and I think it's another interpretation of what the labyrinth is. I think like this story, like this investigation, is his labyrinth.
Okay, yeah. So it sets him on a path on which he is able to sort of stay focused and meditate.
Yeah.
Interesting. I hadn't considered that. That's a really interesting read.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good. That's good stuff, man. At a certain point when we're investigating, Peter will wake us up in the middle of the night and say, time's up. And you'll say, but you didn't give me any time. And he's like, too bad. Peter is out for blood. He is done with this shit. Mm-hmm. While we're out screaming in the town in the middle of the night, the midwife comes out, Agnes, and she says, hey, Rachel's going into labor. Settle the fuck down. And Peter says, okay, you've got until the baby's born. The Duke's men ride into town at that night, and they're like, is it customary of the people here to gather at night? And Peter's basically like, none of your fucking business. But the Duke's men ride in and they say, we're aware that you're holding the Abbey hostage. This needs to end right now, or we're going to charge into the town, and we'll take care of you by force. That happens while we're investigating. We get time after, and then the final day arrives. Peter is in the square. He's gathered everybody. It's time for answers. Justice must be dealt. While we are talking, Veronica will rush out and say, hey, Rachel's given birth successfully. And this kind of stops everybody in their tracks. Everybody goes in to see the baby. This is a really moving scene. She's in there with her baby. It's all bloody because, baby, childbirth. And Klaus is in there and watches his toddler daughter, Magdalene, walk up to this newborn baby and grab its finger.
Yeah.
This recontextualizes everything for him. This changes him on the spot. This is no longer about abstract justice and virtue. Real people's lives are at stake. His daughter's life is at stake. Rachel's newborn baby is at stake. He needs, to Klaus's mind, this needless bloodshed, this holding the Abbey hostage is creating an incredibly volatile environment, and it's going to harm the people that he loves so dearly. And he needs to give his child a proper future and needs to make sure that he's there and is not killed. Now, of course, the rebuttal from Peter is going to be that, the same can be said. This isn't abstract justice. This isn't abstract morals. This is reality. We are dying. We are starving.
Yeah.
How can you turn tail so easily and quickly? It becomes their philosophies are at odds at this point, and they're arguing in here. And Agnes is like, get the fuck out of here. There's a baby. And Peter's like, okay, let's go finish this outside. What did you think about this? Did you agree with Klaus?
Yeah, 100%. I think that, like, obviously it's easy to see both sides of the picture because of how long. I mean, the peasants were suffering from the very beginning. Gernot has been taxing them and limiting their access to the woods, to hunting, to all of the resources that they need to live their lives in a fruitful way for so long. And I think that that's been something that they've had to deal with for obviously quite some time. And it's obviously reached the boiling point here. I think Klaus is obviously in the right. He's looking at the situation where it's like somebody has already died. I don't think that there was ever a need for true bloodshed. But I think that Peter's interpretation of having been maybe one of the elders in this village and tassing for so long and experienced so much oppression, so much domination from the church, from the people who are in power, it going from one hand to another, obviously, over the course of the years. He's had enough of it. So I see why he's doing it, but I'm completely on Klaus's side here, where he's like, he wants no part of this anymore. Like, he realizes that, the moment with the baby is a stark realization of, like, what this actually means. Like, what does the future represent to people? And are you going to just, give into the anger that of what life has set upon you, or are you going to try to maybe do something that's going to allow you to be a little bit more reflective and understanding of what to do going forward in the future?
It's a really challenging situation because I don't think either of them are necessarily wrong.
Yeah, they're not.
And It's funny. I think had you asked me like 4 years ago, I would have been so on Peter's side. Justice needs to be dealt. Violence needs to happen for change, for meaningful change to be enacted. And there is a part of me that still believes that. But the older I get, and maybe some people will see this as me softening or losing my vigor or becoming a dirty centrist.
You mean you're not part of the vanguard still? What do you mean?
as I grow older, I look around at life in general and see so many more shades of gray, and so few things are black and white. And this is a perfect example. I know it's just a video game, so the stakes are small, but it provides a platform to speak about this. Yes, meaningful change can be brought about by violence. I don't think that is an untrue statement, but it's not just as easy as saying yes or no, flip the switch or not. There's so much more nuance to it. And when Klaus said that, I was like, I get it. I totally understand. He doesn't feel good about it. It's not like he's celebrating this, like this isn't a victory to him, but he has been so beaten down that all he wants is to ensure that his loved ones are safe. And if that means, for the time being, bowing to the abbot, so be it. It sucks, but it makes sure that my loved ones are safe.
Yeah.
I get it. I really do. I really do. There's so much nuance and gray in life. I caution everybody listening to look beyond the black and white. So often that's painted by ideological thinking, and it's good sometimes, but it's just as harmful during others. I don't know. I'm not prepared to give a lecture on this.
Yeah, I completely agree with you here. Yeah, the gray areas are what this game is about. Not finding the real answer, not knowing what the right answer is, and not knowing what the just and moral decision is at every point in time, and realizing that like what you may consider just or what you might consider morally viable, there is always an alternate lens that you could look through in order that will allow you to realize that it potentially just is not, that there is something that contradicts what your methodology is, what your thinking is. And I think that's kind of one of the core themes of Pentiment as well, the ambiguity of morality.
Absolutely. Well said. So this doesn't deter Peter at all. They're out in the square again to give Rachel some space. Andreas keeps stalling, and Peter gets so pissed off. It's pretty funny. But this is where we need to give our answers. And Andreas just has one condition. He says, I want Kaspar to get out of here. There's going to be bloodshed. Kaspar had no part in this. He's an innocent third party. And Peter says, yeah, that's fine. Like, get him out of here. And this is where the game pulls one of its biggest subversions. You tell Kaspar to leave, and you get a check, like a roll for check.
Yeah.
And all of the times that you have ever been nice to Kaspar, encouraging him to be a good artist, winning at Lansquenet and showing everybody how cool you are, like I did, anything that made Kaspar like you counts against you here.
Yeah. Yeah.
That blew my mind the first time.
Yeah, and it's something that is really reminiscent from the kind of the source material that Josh Sawyer and the team were pulling from in The Name of the Rose, the relationship of William of Baskerville and his young acolyte, his apprentice. I can't remember the name of Christian Slater's character, but they have a very interesting relationship in that book, and in the movie as well. It depicts the same thing. But the idea is that this is so sad because I always at every opportunity chose to be nice to Kaspar, and in the end that came back to bite me. And it's like the idea of what, so it's another reflection of like the wrong that someone can do in life can sometimes even ultimately lead to good. Because if Kaspar had enough of you, if you had kept him back from staying out at night, if you had at every turn belittled him or called him names for not knowing certain things throughout certain conversations, he chooses to leave. And he chooses that, he chooses to leave behind Andreas, which ultimately saves his life. Not to spoil the future. Right. We haven't gotten that far yet, but yeah.
If you fail the check, you tell him to leave, and he says that he will, but he actually stays behind. He hides to like stick around.
Yep.
So this is where you give your case. I framed Martin because I didn't want to I thought that I had blamed Guy before. It turns out that I hadn't, but I also couldn't blame Hannah. So I was like, okay, Martin, I guess, whatever.
Was this on your second run that you blamed Martin?
This is technically my third.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay.
I guess just every time I get to this point, I have amnesia and I can't remember what I've done before. So it's just Martin every time, even though I'm very sympathetic to him.
Yeah.
But you do that, and Lenhart will come down with his gun. He has a shotgun, a rifle. This is something that we didn't mention as Lenhart's dinner. If you go out to dinner with him, he takes you hunting. He says he'll give you information if you go hunting with him. He ultimately doesn't, but he's just such an asshole. He brags about how like the peasants are worthless. They're the dirt on the dirt of his boots.
Yeah.
But the women are okay. Like they all flock to him. He basically fucks any of the women that he wants. He lures them away from their husbands. Sometimes it's implied that he does it either through coercion. I don't think force, but like definitely coercion. He's just a total scumbag.
Yeah. Piece of shit. 100%. I did actually do the hunt with him. And I remember that there's a choice of whether or not you can shoot the buck that you see out there, and I chose. And you go out there with Caspar, and you're like out in the snow. It's actually a really beautifully painted scene, so I encourage everybody to like do it. It's a very well put together moment, but I chose not to do the buck. But regardless, the relationship with Lenhart doesn't really lead anywhere. It doesn't really do any good for Andreas, and obviously we're in the situation that we are now.
Right, exactly. Whoever you frame, Lenhart is taking them to the mill, and he's saying like he takes all the joy in squashing this revolt because he fucking hates the peasants, and he's gonna, if you try and stop him, he's gonna shoot you. So he goes back to the windmill. Peter says, fuck him. There's so many of us. There's only 2 of them. Let's go. So they storm the windmill, and they've got their pitchforks and torches, just screaming at each other. Lenhart up top with his gun. He's protecting them. He's just waiting for the Dukes to come. During the scuffle, Elsa, Lenhart's wife, and Paul, Lenhart's son, they escape. They escape the clutches of Lenhart. He's basically abusive to both of them. They run away, which is awesome.
Very good for them, yeah.
The music here is fantastic. It really adds a lot of tension. It's very brash, but also remorseful. The scoring is just terrific. In the chaos, in the insanity, Lenhart ends up firing a warning shot. They're arguing, and it is escalating like crazy. And Lenhart fires a warning shot. It accidentally hits Ulrich. This scene is incredible.
Yeah.
The detail on the faces, the music cuts out here. All sound cuts out. The detail on Lenhart's face, you can see he knows that he's just signed his death warrant. He knows that his life is over. With that one shot, with that one accidental hit, he has signed himself to death. He is about to die. And everybody reacts the same way. Peter's like, Jesus Christ, you killed him. Like, you've always been a monster, but murder? And everybody says it's time to burn him alive. And they take their torches and just throw them onto the windmill. So Lenhart burns down in the windmill along with whoever the accused is. And it's kind of sad with Martin here, because this is apparently the 3rd time I've done this to the poor guy. He'll poke his head out at one point and be like, guys, like, I'm really sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted to do right by my family. Like, I wanted to turn my life around. And I felt so bad for the guy. Like, I didn't want to implicate him.
Yeah. I think something similar happens to Brother Guy. At the end of the day, like I remembered as we were kind of talking through this that the finances that he was skimming off the top was actually going towards kind of what was the facsimile of like an underground railroad in Europe at the time that was getting displaced Jewish people that were in areas where they were in danger of being hunted down by the Inquisition was gearing up at this time. It was a thing. The Inquisition actually is one of the principal forces in the Name of the Rose novel, but it kind of gets them away and gets them to a safe place. There is like an underground movement that allows the Jewish people to get out, and that's what his motivation was. And I think that towards the end there, like he expresses his remorse, he expresses his regret as the windmill is burning down. Yeah, sad.
Wow, nobody expects the Inquisition.
Oh my God!
I'm pretty sure that's a different Inquisition. um, that's really sad. This game does morality so fucking well, and knowing Josh Sawyer's history with games, I'm not surprised. So the mob makes it to the Abbey now, where the brothers have been left out. Klaus is there with Andreas, and we let them out. They're like, Peter got his justice. You're fine. Peter has to keep his promise. This is another fucking amazing scene. Peter comes back in along with the mob, and the monks are like, Peter, like, everything is okay. You got your justice. The Duke will understand. He's sensible. Nobody else needs to die. Everything can go back to the way it was before.
Yep. Which is obviously not true.
Well, I would argue that it is true.
You think so?
Think about it. Peter's face, immediately, he knows exactly what that means. Everything will go back to the way it was before.
Yeah,
Peasants
that's true.
will not have anything. They will be starved to feed the Abbey. The Abbey is taking the money from their pockets. They're not allowed to live. They're going to die.
Yeah.
And Peter knows this. All of the hope, this is so amazingly animated. All of the hope is drained out of his face. And he says, right, the way it was before. Like nothing ever happened. He's beyond the veil. Nothing, no matter what happens from here on out, will ever be the same again. His hope is gone. He's lost so much. He only has one thing that he can do here. He resigns his fate. He calmly and slowly walks into the library, drops his torch, and sets it ablaze. And he walks out as slow as he walked in. And Big Jorg is like, Dad, what did you do? And he's like, nothing will ever change. This is all we have in life. Nothing will ever change. Everything that he stood for has been snapped in half.
Yeah, it is tragic because you've seen, like, Peter obviously is the most mentally unsound person in the village, obviously because of what he's experienced over his many years in the suffering that he's been dealt with at the hands of the Abbey, at the hands of the church, and the righteous anger that he feels like he has. And obviously he understands at a certain level, once Linhart has been killed, his windmill has been burned down, that the obviously in the other townsfolk, they have been enraged to such a degree. They've been brought obviously to the Abbey. Andreas is trying to stand between them and reason, kind of obviously with Andreas at the losing end of this. And this is something that I don't know if we brought up earlier, but I thought it was very interesting when Andreas was trying to present his findings on the accused earlier, of how much flack Andreas was catching either at the hands of Peter or at the hands of the townsfolk. Like, it almost felt like Andreas felt like he himself was on trial. And I think he carries a lot of guilt with him at other certain points in time. But I agree with you as well. Like, I think that this ending scene is incredibly powerful and incredibly important to what the next moment is going to happen in this narrative.
That's a cool interpretation with Andreas being on trial. He is definitely not, and this is something that plays into Act 3. He's not necessarily well liked at all.
No,
nobody wants him there or appreciates him. He at that point, he's just a mouthpiece to getting them the justice, the change that they so desire. And look where the change got them. It got them absolutely nothing.
Right.
And everything Peter stood for has been crumbled. This is such a good scene. The library is on fire. This is where the Duke's men ride in, and this act ends. It shows it pans over a still painting of the Abbey burning, the Duke's men coming in, fighting the townsfolk. Some of the Duke's men are dying. Some of the townsfolk end up dying here. The brothers move to safety, and Andreas ends up dying in the fire. And I've seen this criticism levied, so this isn't anything that I'm saying new, but Andreas will run back in ravenously to try and save the books.
Yes. Yep.
Like I said, I'm not the first to make this criticism, but if you don't choose the bookworm path, this kind of feels like it's out of left field. You know what I mean?
It does, but I think that, this could be true. I don't remember choosing the bookworm path or not, but like, I feel like in Act 1, specifically in Act 1, Andreas expresses such a love and fascination for the books of the Abbey, and the fact that like the abbots and everybody in the brothers of the Abbey kept the library locked away behind the door, and so like there was this like forbidden knowledge nature that's wrapped up in it, and like whenever Andreas does have access to a book, he's very reverent of it. It made sense for me. It worked for me, and also 100%. This is one for one, just William of Baskerville. He stays.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's a moment where there is a hidden library within inside the abbey, and it's burning down. And there's a moment where he and his apprentice are separated, and he's like, "I have to save the books. I have to save the books." And he goes back in, and that's the last time that you see him at that. It's literally one for one. It's great.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I'm so kicking myself for not reading the source material.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly recommend. I think that you would specifically enjoy watching, because I mean, this is what I most recently. I've been reading through it. I've been flipping through it as well. But like, I think Rick, you would particularly enjoy The Name of the Rose with Sean Connery and Christian Slater. Like, it's recent. Like, especially once we're done with this and we've done our critical analysis of Pentiment, like, and this goes for the listeners as well, like, watch that movie, because if you've enjoyed this game, you will absolutely enjoy the film adaptation of The Name of the Rose. It's so good.
So Andreas dies in the library. If you did not successfully send Caspar away, he will come back and try and save you, which causes him to die as well. And this act actually concludes with a little note on the screen being read from Andreas's estate, basically saying that it confirms his death, and all of the commissions that were paid for his art are non-refundable and are going to Sabine, his wife, which is kind of funny to me. Not because it's going to his wife, but because like the patrons are just out of their money.
Yeah.
Kind of funny.
Yeah, that's very funny.
And this puts us into the final act, Act 3.
Mm-hmm.
And this act, from everything I've read, this act gets the most criticism. It gets the most criticism specifically for its pacing. And I understand that. I can sympathize with that. I think this act is very fascinating in its own right. We are 18 years in the future now, and we are playing as Klaus's daughter, Magdalene. The passage of time is really on display here. Those who we knew as babies and children are now grown up.
Yeah.
They have families of their own. Religion here is on the downward slope. This is getting into the Reformation. You see this, well, partly in game. We're now not progressing through time through the monastic hours, through the divine office. We're going through using this 24-hour clock that is at first kind of tough to read, but you get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
The young people greetings between young people. They're not saying God bless you. They're kind of just saying hello.
Yep. Everything's more secular.
Yes. And this act in particular, it's very inward facing. It's very reflective. We're going to be everybody that you can talk to almost. In Acts 1 and 2, at different times, you might go up and talk to somebody, and they might just say, God be with you, Andreas. Here, it seems like everybody has a conversation to have with you, and it's very inward facing. It's very reflective. We're thinking about the events of the past. And what's interesting, I have this in the notes later, but it's just coming out of my mouth now. A lot of people look back on Andreas fondly here, even though they weren't fond of him whenever he was doing his shtick.
Yeah, 100%. And I didn't know if you had any more details to kind of like iterate on that, but I can only agree with you. I find that supremely fascinating. And it's another part of history where it's like, as soon as somebody's gone, as soon as somebody's out of your life, this is something that I personally in my own life am guilty of looking into my past and being like, oh, they weren't that bad. The situation wasn't that bad. Oh, like they had all of these good qualities. I always look in the past with rose tinted lenses. And I think that like the death of Andreas, especially the violent way that he died, and the fact that like, even though people in the community could interpret that he like did some serious harm to Tassing, I still think that it is really, really funny as you go throughout this act that you're talking to different folks and they're like, oh yes, I remember Andreas fondly, and he and Caspar both were wonderful people, for the community, whatever the case may be. But I also think that has to do with the fact that they're talking to Magdalene. I think that your experience as Magdalene, and personally, I think Act 3, for whatever criticism people want to levy at, is one of the best uses of what the team was trying to convey about the way that history changes with time and the way that history changes with perspective. Because everyone that you talk to is different because you're playing or you're looking at them and you're interfacing with them through the lens of Magdalene. Everybody's friendlier. Everybody's more willing to give you information. And I think that that's like super important and interesting to me, just like as a player going through. And I will note the one thing that like is interesting about me as a player. Obviously, I get very emotionally attached to the main characters that I play as. When Andreas died in the second act, Rick, I was so upset by I was so upset by this because like he's such a well-written, interesting character. He and Caspar both. And the fact that at the end of the second act, they were both dead, that was such a shock to me. I know I didn't, like, when we were covering it, I didn't kind of reiterate that or drive that point home enough to me, but I was shocked that they were going to be dead.
Oh, yeah.
And then, like, we start Act 3 and we're a completely different character, Magdalene. I didn't even recognize Magdalene as Klaus's daughter when we first started. I'm like, we're playing as a completely new character? What? Everything that I did was lost? Like, I literally put the game down. I put the game down for months after I played it.
I think that's one of the reasons people don't like Act 3 as much, is because we are now playing as somebody that is essentially a stranger. Yeah. I don't agree with that criticism. I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah.
But it highlights another theme of this game. The wheel of time moves ever forward. The cycle of life will always push forward. Right. And to your comments about everybody, painting Andreas in a more flattering light, I say again, history is neither fact nor true. It is what we leave behind.
Yeah.
Pentimento, that is exactly what's happening here. It's brilliant. Can't praise this game enough. It's so good. Because this act is so much more reflective also, we might get through it a little quicker. We'll still try and talk about everything that needs to be, but specifically, well, let's talk about this now. This is next in the notes. Magdalene's background choices. You get to choose some of her background, but specifically I wanted to put them up as a duality to Andreas's, because I think there is a really unique commentary going on here. I said duality to Andreas's. I wanted to save that word specifically. I keep vocab words in my quiver like arrows that I can just fire off, and I just wasted one. There is a duality here of what it means to be a woman in this time period, while also playing as one and subverting some of those expectations. And I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because we think back to Andreas's choices. He was educated, and of course some of it's class too, right? I mean, Magdalene is a townsperson. She has money. Klaus has more money than a lot of the townspeople, but she's not wealthy or educated. Andreas, he could be a scholar. He was into rhetoric. He could be a hedonist. When we get to choose for Magdalene, her choices feel more gendered. She could be a snoop. She could be a flirt. You could choose a personality trait called barbed tongue, which means that you're just like, you give a tongue lashing. Everything she says is so fucking mean and cruel. It's really hard to choose that one.
I started through with that one.
So I did 3 full playthroughs and a half, like a 2/3 of another. The 2/3 I chose that one, and everything was just so mean and awful, and I hated choosing it. But it's interesting because all of these feel very gendered. Like, oh, she's a woman, so of course she can sew. She can do the balancing of the account books. And it feels intentionally gendered, but then playing through as Magdalene, we're subverting a lot of that. Like the first scene here, we basically put 3 boys, Utz, Apollo, and one other who I can't remember, into their place. They're giving us shit for being a woman, basically, and we don't take any of it. And it's this really cool duality. I really like Magdalene as a character.
Yeah, she's a great character. And it's also, you talk about the choices being different and gendered. It's interesting because those choices are also limited. I felt like, reminiscing, going back and creating Andreas' character, I had this whole list of background options to choose from. And I think that's obviously indicative of what his class was, at that period of history. And obviously she has a limited amount, she is advantaged because of her education and because of the fact that she's working for a printing press operator who is that, and that's a pivotal job at this moment in history. But the fact that she has access to education and resources, and some of that is still interesting, even though that like her environmental scope of what she has at her disposal to like as the player to create her or mold her as the character you want to be into role play as, it's still limited, and I think that's significant for this period of time.
So this act sort of starts. There is a mural being painted at the rat house. Klaus is in charge of it. There are arguments about the mural. Klaus wants to depict the truth. This mural is going to depict the history of Tassing. Klaus very much wants to depict the truth of what happened, specifically with the revolt. He feels incredibly guilty at this point that he did so little back then. And, going back to this, like both of us, you said that you were like on Klaus's side. I kind of was more in the center. Like I really feel sympathy for both. This to me is showing that there is no right option. Right. There is Peter stood by his ideals, and he did not feel like he accomplished what he wanted to do. Peter is dead at this point, by the way. He died that night. Klaus stood by his ideals, but now he regrets it. This is highlighting that idea that the wheel of time is ever turning, and just as life continues to go on in terms of the biological cycle, so too does the emotional cycle of life go on. Klaus has regrets. He has a few, as Frank Sinatra sang. He wants to make them right now. So he wants to depict this mural of the revolts, specifically honoring Peter and everything that happened. Werner has an interesting quote here. Father Thomas, Werner, Big Jorg, they're all on the council.
Yeah.
Everybody's kind of giving their opinions. Like Big Jorg's a little in the middle. He's like, I don't want to upset anybody, but I want to honor my dad. Father Thomas is like, we're not doing that.
Yep.
Everybody's different. Werner says, I think Father Thomas means that the truth is not so easily agreed upon.
That's right.
I love that line.
It's a good line.
One more thing. There is a new lord. A landlord, not a divine lord.
Yep.
And they're worried about angering their lord.
Do we get any indication as to, I cannot remember from my playthrough who it is. Do they give any specificity as to like, or is it just kind of like this distant person that's off in maybe one of the capitals that has now been just handed the the title to Tassing? Is that what it is, you think?
I will be honest, I don't quite remember.
Okay. Yeah, because obviously
Sorry.
I know that they're like omnipresent, and like the fact that they have this new lord is a recurring theme that will come back up with multiple different characters. But
yeah, they traded one lord for another. They traded the abbot and his taxes for a new lord who is a little more cruel, and his men scour the forest and patrol it like a police force.
Yeah, which is not good.
No. There's a great Klaus quote here. I just thought that it was pertinent. About the mural, he says, I've spent my whole life illustrating and printing other people's stories. For the first time, I feel like this is my story to tell. We hear all of these stories about what this place was, how it came to be, and it feels like history is something that happened before, happened to other people. Everyone wants to forget about it, pretend it didn't happen. All those years ago, I did nothing. I was worried for you, he's speaking to Magdalene. I was so afraid that I'd lose you. In the end, many people died anyway, and we lived. Maybe I could have stopped them from going to the mill or burning the abbey down, but we'll never know. The least I can do is make sure it isn't forgotten. Beautiful.
Yeah, it's super beautiful. And like this moment in time obviously is very important to him as he's moving forward, and obviously that's going to be a huge motivation to what we're looking at through the rest of this act. But yeah, this is kind of just circling back in and kind of driving home the point of what we've been talking about, the transmutable nature of history, and how different people want to approach it, how the different people in the room, even on the council, still want to look back on history, how they want other people to look at the history that's been depicted here. And it's a big point of contention. I also love the fact that in this conversation, wait, no, I'm jumping too far ahead. Anyway, let's continue. Sorry.
Magdalene has a pen pal now. It is Rachel and Jacob's baby, Esther. They live in Prague, and you'll periodically be writing to her. This is another sign that times are changing. Literacy and penmanship are much more common. That night, after the mural arguments and everything, Klaus is attacked in your home. Someone breaks into the shop, messes things up, and bashes Klaus on the head. This is a little funny because Magdalene's bed is directly to the left of the door and directly across the room from Klaus's office. So I don't know how they snuck in without Magdalene knowing.
Waking up, yeah, exactly.
But Klaus is like severely injured. There's blood all over the floor. He is crumpled, and we don't know who assaulted him. The next morning after Klaus is attacked, everybody from the town council comes to pay their respects. The mural is going to be put on hold, obviously. Magdalene says that she'll step up, and you have to kind of convince them. Some people are a little more ready to accept it than others. Werner just doesn't think you should do it because you're a woman, and also you should be taking care of Klaus.
Yeah.
He is completely bedridden at this point.
Yeah.
Big Georg is like, again, kind of in the middle. But eventually you convince everybody, as long as you keep them involved in what you're planning to do. Werner also, as everybody leaves, he holds you back and he's like, hey, he's got brain damage, Klaus does. He's going to die. It might not be next week or next month, but he will die.
Yeah, I thought this was a really kind of emotionally poignant part. And it also like puts a timer on the investigation again, or rather what becomes the investigation, of course, because we don't quite realize that that's what this isn't turning into quite yet. But yeah, it creates another sense of time urgency because Klaus obviously feels so strongly about having this mural be done and then be done properly. And then Magdalene's close relationship with him, she shares all his ideals. She carries all those ideals with her. And I thought it was particularly important. This is what I had meant that I was kind of veering towards earlier is, no future spoilers. They happen when they happen, but they, obviously once Klaus is hit and she's here, she's like, hey, I'm the only one that can do this. And she convinces the other people in the room that like, I'm the one that's going to do it and I'm going to do it properly. No one else is going to really be able to, especially since my dad can't. And I thought that was really cool because it kind of sets up the precedent of who Magdalene as a character. She means business and she's not going to take shit from anybody. Obviously, as we had seen with her interaction with the boys earlier. But she and especially I imagine when if you choose the cutting words background, I imagine she probably has some particularly choice things to say for people in this scene, but I still think that it's important because it's painting her as a strong character, which is not typical for women in this period of history, but I enjoyed it for sure.
Right, exactly. And like Josh Sawyer has said before, history is typically written by men in power. Yep. That doesn't mean that, women like Magdalene or Jewish people or people without faith or queer people, people with disabilities, it doesn't mean that they didn't exist. They're just so often not depicted.
Yeah, exactly.
So another criticism of Act 3 is that, like you said, we are doing an investigation of sorts. And it's cut into sort of 3 parts, learning about the ancient history of Tassing, learning about the founding of the Abbey, and then talking to people about the revolt. What people don't like about this is it is completely on rails. In the first 2 acts, you can't exhaust every bit of information. You have to replay it if you want to hear everybody's evidence, have meals with everybody, things like that. Here, you're not going to be eating with people in this act, and also you just sort of exhaust all of the evidence each time. So that, I totally think that's a valid criticism. I think that, to me, was the pacing issue for me. It wasn't so much that everybody had a conversation that they wanted to have with you. It was just that this felt so much like it was on rails compared to the last 2.
Yeah, I can see people's perspective there. My interpretation of it is that, like, we're trying to wrap up the story. This game isn't, it's relatively short, but for me, I feel like, I'm a slow reader. I like to really absorb the games that I play. Like, at this point in Act 3, it had taken me quite some time to get here. And I am the way that I like to play games, I'm perfectly okay with her just being like, okay, I don't have to worry, at least in Act 3, I'm missing something, because that's an anxiety that I always have. I want to exhaust all of the content that's available to me when I'm playing games, and the fact that you actually can't mechanically in the first two acts was a little bit of a stressor, but you have to accept that that's part of the experience. It's a reflection of real life. But here I understand what people's problem was with it in this third part.
So the first section is learning about the ancient history of tassing. I think just like the last two investigations, we don't need to touch on every single detail in high fidelity to get through this.
Yeah.
Learning about the ancient history of tassing is interesting because what you're learning is actually akin to real life, is that a lot of the Christian traditions and the Catholic traditions that we know of in tassing are lifted from pagan traditions.
Yes.
St. Moritz, who, by the way, there is a monument of St. Moritz, a headless monument of St. Moritz out in the field. It's been there since Act 1. We're bringing that up now because it's kind of like Chekhov's monument. It should have been introduced in Act 1 because it goes off in Act 3, but it's there.
Yeah.
And it becomes important. You talk to Il Peter, you talk to Black Till, you can get the Historia Tassiae from Brigitta. Whenever Martin stole it back in Act 1, she kept it, and you can take it from her. Your Latin, even if you know Latin, it's not strong enough, so you have to bring it to other people. I never did get it translated. I don't know if you can, but you can get it. But you're learning throughout this act that the pagan traditions are the roots of everything.
Yeah, right.
And this kind of mirrors real life. I mean, when we think about Christianity, the symbol of the cross was lifted from pagan traditions. December 25th was chosen as Christ's birthday because it was a pagan holiday. They wanted to, put that Christian stamp on it. I'm not making any moral judgments or value judgments, but the fact, I almost said the facts of history. Can't say that. What we know of history is that Christianity was used at one point in time as a means of getting paganism out of there.
Right.
And we see that a lot with Christian imagery.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely the Christian influence over the course of history, and obviously I knew about this since I was very young. Obviously, my mother is somebody who relayed this to me early on, is that Christianity, she called it like the ultimate. She called it like the Borg of all religions. It's assimilating and consuming almost so many different facets and aspects of and I know that's probably a very heretical thing to say for people out there, so feel free to edit that at your discretion, Rick. But I think that it is interesting because it draws so much. I mean, you think about the Christmas tree, that's a pagan tradition. You think about all of the even some of the depictions of eagles, or the depictions of the circles that are behind in Renaissance paintings of portraits of saints. Obviously the circle of light that always kind of sits behind them, that's supposed to be depicting the halo, that's pulled from Hinduism, right? So it's there are so many aspects, and even deeper than what my knowledge is of Christian history and everything like that I would be able to relay on this podcast. But yeah, I think that it is fascinating. I thought that this was one of my favorite parts. It's something that you have written a little bit later in the notes, but it's the pagan celebration of Perchtilov. Is that, I probably said that. I butchered that. I'm sure I did. But 100% I felt like that was one of the coolest moments, because everybody is, and this is something similar to what we've experienced earlier in Act 1 with the different celebrations that they've had, where the townsfolk will dress up and wear masks and go around. It's just very reminiscent of what these early pagan cultural European celebrations were like at this point in time. And you see those clashing of cultures here, obviously, and with the omnipresent kind of grounding point of Christianity being that one thing that's pulling us through this story.
Yeah. I'm really kicking myself for not writing down the actual myths from the game. Before we started recording today, I was looking on the internet for a full script of Pentiment. I was looking through the Pentiment wiki, and I couldn't find the full text of these myths in the game. But Saint Moritz and Saint Satia in Tassing, the Christian tradition is that they became Christian martyrs fighting off the Romans here, so they became the patron saints. The pagan tradition is that Saint Moritz helped an injured wolf that was part of Perchta's wild hunt, so she commanded it to lead him to this spring where Tassing was created on. The Roman myth involved, you hear this from Smokey, the Roman myth involved Mars and a nymph. Basically, it's a Roman myth, so they're having sex. That's what created fertility in the ground. It's the same. It's the origin story, just viewed through a different lens, right? Through the history that was left behind, right? Those become the facts, and that's how we're viewing this. Yeah, really, really kicking myself for not writing these down a little better. But that is Act 1, and at the end, that is Part 1, and at the end, you get to decide how you want to depict this section of the mural. You can depict the Roman with, which is what I did, with Mars and the nymph kind of fornicating for fertility in the land. You can depict the Tassing tradition. You can depict the pagan tradition. Which did you choose?
I chose the Roman tradition as well.
Nice.
I wanted to relay the truth as I interpreted it. So yeah, that's what I chose.
You can when Smokey's telling you that, you can make Magdalene laugh at a sex joke, and I like that.
Yeah,
it's pretty good. This is also where you first encounter during this part. You can explore the salt mines down here. Salt was incredibly important to people of this time period, to the Romans, excuse me. So this salt mine, you can see a lot of stuff down here. This is also where the worst minigame in the game is, where you're picking up those pots.
I did not like this.
Yeah, it's not intuitive. But this is the first time when you're down there, you see somebody above is sort of trailing you. You can never see them. They just appear as a shadow, and here they kick a rock down at you.
Yep. I thought this moment was really peculiar because as Andreas in Act 1, and then obviously Andreas in Caspar in Act 2, you don't actually see anybody in the background, via the notes that you're picking up. And this is something that we've talked about earlier in part 1 of this podcast. But as you're going out throughout these investigations, throughout these conversations that you're having with people, Andreas and now Magdalene are picking up these notes that are in purple ink, that are in transparent ink, another pull directly from the Name of the Rose, that are relaying to them that there's somebody behind the scenes. There is a thread puller. There is a manipulator that is behind the scenes that is causing stress, that is causing issues, and we don't know if they're the direct cause of the murder, the death, the mayhem, the carnage that Tassing has experienced throughout the course of this game, but we know that they are directly involved. And it's always very interesting when you pick it up, because especially in Acts 1 and 2, particularly in Act 2 that we kind of glaze past, that there are several moments where there are warnings, there are threats, there are notes that are left behind in this ink that directly tie into the investigations that Andreas started. And it's like you're acting as Magdalene in the second half, you're picking up the pieces that were left behind, and you're continuing to find these notes. That's what kind of kicked off this earlier point in time, is that there was a note that was left inside of Klaus's house that said "just stop," something along those lines. I don't know if that's exactly. It said "just stop," and he didn't listen. And then now we're full blown, and he's gravely injured. And now you're as Magdalene realizing that there's a slippery slope of events. So as I was playing through the section, you see this dark figure in the background. I was like, what is going on? Are they following her? Do they realize that she poses some type of threat to this mystery that they don't want the people of Tassing to find out about? So yeah, very interesting.
Thank you for not letting me forget about the notes. We as the players can probably assume that whoever is the thread puller is also the one that attacked Klaus. Magdalene wouldn't know that, but we kind of do.
Yeah.
So this next section, you are exploring the history of Kearsarge Abbey, and you write to Brother Matthew. You can write to him. He is an archdeacon somewhere else with Rudiger, which is a nice touch. When you write to him, you can see Rudiger in the background, just kind of there, So that's nice.
Yeah.
You'll speak with the nuns here, the Poor Clares, and you kind of lie to them. You say, "I'm thinking about becoming a nun." And they let you into their covenant so you can look around and learn more about the founding of the abbey. It is a double abbey, which means there are just nuns and monks. But at one point in time, it was originally run by an abbess, I think, prioress.
I think you're right. Yeah, prioress or abbess. Yeah.
Eventually, it transitioned to just an abbot and a prior, probably just to appeal the larger Roman Catholic Church.
Yep.
Because women.
Those darn women getting us every time.
It's nice. You get to revisit all the nuns from Act 1, as well as a couple new ones. You also get to explore the ruins of the abbey here. And if you go, well, not if you go, you have to go, to the mural of the Dance of Death, which was there in Act 1 and Act 2, you can see that somebody as recently as a couple months ago has been painting over this. It looks a little crude, so you might not expect who it is at first, but once you see the depictions of who it's representing, it becomes pretty clear right away. You'd see a depiction of the Baron. You see a depiction of whoever you killed in Act 1 and Act 2. If Caspar died, you see a depiction of him. It doesn't tell you, but it's very, very clear who this is.
Oh, I'm an idiot though, Rick. You always discount. You always don't count that part in. I'm stupid. I'm so dumb because I did not pick up on this the first playthrough.
It's Caspar. If you see Caspar, I think that's what makes it click, because you might not assume that this is Andreas at first because it's drawn so crudely and he's a master artist.
Right.
But it's seeing Caspar that immediately clued me in. Something that I liked was if you get Martin killed, he's depicted as a man with two heads because he had that dual identity.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Very clever.
Yeah,
very clever.
That is cool.
And finally, you explore the town for the truth of the revolt. Something that you learn by talking to everybody is that everybody is really reticent to talk about that night.
Yeah,
it still looms very. It casts a long shadow in their hearts.
It's 18 years later, Rick, but like
that's not that long.
It's not that long. And as a person, like, I mean, I'm not old. I will admit I'm not old, but like I feel old. In my 30s, in my early 30s, and I'm like thinking back to like I remember what happened 18 years ago, and I imagine for the older adults that are in this town, the people who are getting on on the borderline of elderly, 18 years is probably like a blink of an eye. So it's trauma. The trauma is still present, and I mean, imagine your entire town burning down around you, soldiers coming in to completely eviscerate your poor neighbors with pikes and tridents, like whatever the case may be. It's that's trauma that you can't easily let go of. So I totally understood why people didn't want to talk to Magdalene as much, or were reticent to bring it up, or reticent to be as forthcoming when it came to this aspect of history.
When you do actually talk to them, though, it's interesting that so many of them sort of view that time a bit softer than they did at the time.
Yeah.
People at the time that were calling for this to stop, this is needless violence, they're thinking back and they're thinking about, how the peasants were right, actually. Or, it's good what Andreas was doing. Everybody fondly remembers Andreas, like we mentioned before, when it's like at the time, everybody thought that he was just being nosy and just meddling.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And it's not a flaw within them as people, right? It's just, this is just an observance of how humans and their minds and their hearts can change under the passage of time. Agnes, to that end, Agnes has a really nice quote. She'll tell you, the dead are luckier. They died believing they changed something, but we get to live with the harsh reality.
Yeah, it's the people and what they leave behind again kind of comes back to us here. And it's fascinating to me as we're going through it and as we're trying to like depict these murals and what's happening into the history and the people's reflection. Again, like I go back to what I had said earlier about the rose tinted glasses. I think that's true for so many people. I don't think that's exclusive to me. I think that some people that aren't me have the ability to look through a lens in the past with a little bit more basis on reality. But I think I share maybe similarities with a lot of folks out there that it's like, I want to look into the past in a better light, because that means that the things that I went through that were hard in my past, like the difficult moments in my history, namely, if you were a person in this town and you went through the butchering of Tassing, whatever they would want to call it at that point, right? Like you would want to think about it a little bit more fondly, because then that means it meant something. It means that you're in a better place today. And I think that's super important for so many of the different people that you talk to, particularly Ill Peter as well.
Oh, speaking of Ill Peter, I learned he can die before Act 3, I think.
Really?
I don't remember how. That's how. In the beginning of Act 1, you have, like, the very first choice you have is to help the Gertners get some money for their taxes.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, that's right.
all the way in Act 1. And I think if you don't do that, Il Peter dies over the winter.
Interesting, because they don't have enough to take care of him. Wow. Okay, because
Yeah.
I remember giving a good portion of my wages as Andreas to them, and it ultimately, like, there's no real economy in this game, so it's just a matter of like, what kind of person do you want to be as Andreas? So that's fascinating, though. Didn't realize that.
Yeah, neat little thing. I think I learned that on the wiki.
Okay.
But this section ends with what you mentioned earlier, Nick, with Perchtenlauf, which is interpreted here as depicting the White Saint leading Perchta's demons into the woods to scare off the evil spirits for the townsfolk. And it's followed by a big feast. Perchtenlauf is a real thing, and it was often celebrated in Bavaria around this time, pagan traditions. It's all about the wild hunt for these pagan townsfolk, because remember, they were pagans here before the Christians settled. They believed that celebrating it in this way would help the spirits go into the woods and ward off evil spirits. So they were protecting them, and they kind of keep this here to this day. But the townsfolk don't view this as like pagan. They just think, oh, isn't this pretty? Isn't this fun?
Yeah.
Isn't this nice? Il Peter, if he's here, he is gung ho about this. He's like, I haven't missed this since I have never missed this, and I'll be damned if I'm going to miss it now, because he is still outwardly pagan.
Yeah, he has a very cool animation too when they're having that whole scene, and he's like clapping his hands.
Clapping.
He is in it. He is in it. I love that part. Yeah,
it's the first time you've seen him feel joy in this whole game.
Right.
Oh, it's really nice. It's really nice. And then afterwards, there's a big feast. Jorg will make a little speech, which is kind of, he's a very humble guy, so he wasn't expecting it. And you can razz him, or you can tell him good job. You get to talk to all of the townsfolk here, and specifically, you'll talk to them since, just like in the last act, this is a time of merriment, social lubricant of alcohol. You can learn their loose lippins. Oh my God, their lips loosen.
Yeah.
Spoonerizing everything. Their lips loosen, and they'll tell you this is where some people remember it fondly. Some people it still casts the shadow. I didn't take a lot of notes on this just because it kind of jives with everything we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Some people remember it as a missed opportunity. Some are just sad to see that people have lost their lives. It's a lot of what we've already talked about here.
Yeah.
And it'll end, this section does, with two traveling minstrels, playing a little song for you here. And this, man, I had this maybe later in the notes, or maybe I realized it during one of the last scenes, but like this game is really making me regret not keeping up with my early music knowledge, because
Really?
like I mentioned before, I went through 2 remedial classes, and the second one in particular was really good.
Yeah.
And I came out of it like really knowing this stuff and like having a great appreciation for this time period. And it's just like anything, man. I mean, knowledge very much is, if you don't use it, you tend to lose it.
Right.
If it's
Right.
not really in your long-term memory, that's can't go into how brains work here. But it was something that wasn't ingrained in my long-term memory, right? I remembered it all throughout the years that I was at school, but since then I haven't thought about it, and it's just kind of gone away, and it bums me out a little bit. Like I really like this time period for music. It's very interesting, and I don't remember it very well now.
It's interesting from from the standpoint of like a thematic structure, as well as just like music theory structure and how it's evolved over time. Like, I feel like maybe some people would look at it as too repetitive or too simplistic. I look at some of the music, and shout out again, I know that we've said this before in the first episode, but shout out to Alchemy for doing an incredible depiction of what the kind of music that you would expect to experience in this era would be like, and like just helping us immerse ourselves in this game and in this period of time. Like, they're pulling from Greek instruments, they're pulling obviously from traditional pagan instruments, and you know much more about this period of history, or what they do to kind of like make all of it work together, I feel like, Rick. But like, again, like the setting and the music in this game is just top notch, and they really pulled it off there, I think.
Yeah, they used instruments that they used in this time, and they directly used melodies and pieces from this time period and arranged it as well. It's really good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say, if I can indulge myself a little bit in asking you a little bit of knowledge, like as a classically trained musician, like how do you go about learning that kind of thing? Like learning those ancient instruments, or learning how, like, are there musical records of songs that were written at this period of time that you can go back and recreate or learn the basis of, and then like as a musician just kind of like abstract yourself to create original music from this period?
Well, I mean, this is an entire field in and of itself. I mean, I went to school, for example, for saxophone performance. Some people might go to school for jazz saxophone performance. Some people go to school for historical performance, where they do their degree on lutes or a recorder or harpsichord. This is an entire field of ethnomusicology where this is studied. You can see a lot of special collections libraries will have manuscripts from this era on display. And we got to flip through some of that while at school in Kansas City. And it's just, this is an entire field. It's not
Okay, gotcha.
It is much it requires much more study than just like, I play violin in the symphony, but now I'm also an early music specialist. It's like probably not. You're probably one or the other.
Okay, that makes sense. So you would imagine that the people that are in this group, like, they 100% specialize in exactly what they were being asked of in this here. So it's like second nature for them to put the soundtrack together. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. Good question, though.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it's, a little bit of history, does it hurt to do a little bit of education on the show, right?
Of course not. Of course not. Walking back from Perchtenlauf, Magdalene will see that shadowy figure following her once again, and her door is open when she returns home. Klaus is okay, but, Magdalene will go down to get him soup, and when she goes down, the camera stays on the door in the room, and the door closes, and out steps this hooded figure. And for a minute, you're like, oh, Klaus is in danger, but it's clear from how they speak to each other that it's Andreas.
Yeah.
And he eventually does remove his hood and introduces himself when Magdalene comes back. He's bearded, he's old, he's completely weathered. He was surviving by staying in the shadows. He somehow got out. I think Caspar pulls him out if Caspar dies. I don't remember how, if he's alive, or if Caspar's alive, but Andreas has been living in secret, just eating scraps of bread, stealing books to keep his mind active.
Yeah.
And he's just felt nothing but guilt and sorrow for years. It's degraded his mind because he could not save everybody from the thread puller.
Yeah, I thought that, so in reading this, when this moment happens, this moment was very surprising to me. I did not piece two and two together about the paintings that had been put over the mural, and of like the depictions when you're, re-exploring the Abbey as Magdalene, right? And seeing what was in there. Obviously, I'm glad that you put that together. I wish I paid a little bit closer attention as I was going through that. But this shocked me. This shocked me, that the fact that Andreas was alive, like, it's like re-experiencing the grief all over again after putting this game down for months and being like, okay, I'm going to pick back up again. I'm going to do Pentiment. I'm going to finish Pentiment. It's on my list. And then, getting to this moment and realizing, oh my God, Andreas was alive this entire time. And then looking at what had become of him, like looking what had happened to his life. Like, this was such an important moment for me in this game, and it's again what solidifies this game as like one of the coolest that I've played in recent history, and especially just like one of the coolest AA games that you can put your hands on, period. Is like this like narrative reveal of him coming back again. It's William of Baskerville. He goes back in to, save the books inside of the hidden crypt inside of like the secret library of the Abbey, but then finds another way out of it, and he shows back up just at the right time to kind of help out like what's going on to the people, and try to subvert expectations of the audience at that time. And it's just so cool. And Rick, I don't know if you had this written down or anything to bring this up, or maybe have remembered it from watching this, but people had like cast like questions about like, how can a person just live off of scraps and like, as a hermit and no human can anybody really survive for 20 plus years without any human contact? And this is actually based off of a real person that they're pulling a hermit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's Christopher Thomas Knight was a real hermit from like 1965. They called him like the North Pond Hermit, and he was a former recluse and a burglar, and it claimed to live without human contact, with a couple of exceptions, for about 27 years from 1986 to 2013, and literally just lived by breaking into people's houses and stealing food.
Oh my
And
gosh.
not interacting with anybody. So it's like this is what they're pulling from as like a real person, and that's what has become of Andreas. And honestly, it's a sad thing to see that happen to Andreas, because you would have, me personally, I would have thought that maybe, oh, he was using this time. Like, I mean, I guess you can't explain why people do what they do, right? And I think it's very interesting and very nuanced thing to have this happen to the character. But Andreas was just so full of life and inquisitive, and like he was so inquisitive, and he was so ardent in his pursuit of the truth. You would have thought like he would have taken some time and then gotten back on the saddle and tried to really go for it. But the fact that he's gotten completely lost in his own grief, in his own guilt, is just like, it's so sad to see what happens to him here.
Yeah, you really see the effects that being a hermit has had on his body and on his mind. His mind especially. He has no manners anymore. This happens a couple times, and he'll apologize and say, "Yeah, sorry, I'm just not used to being around people anymore."
Yeah.
He thinks that the thread puller is still active. He thinks Andreas has learned the history of Tassing by now, and he doesn't tell us, but he says that it's going to shock everybody. He thinks that the thread puller is still alive. He wants to stop Klaus from completing the mural, and Magdalene too. And he believes that the thread puller even had Matthias killed.
Yeah.
Father Matthias, remember, is the abbot before Guerneau, the one that was really into books and had the Historia Tassing. So, knowing all of this, at the behest of Klaus, because Magdalene doesn't want to leave him, but he says, no, go. Magdalene and Andreas go to search the aqueducts. There is a secret path underneath of the rat house to find this temple, this room called the Mithraeum, the like worship room of Mithra, I think is like roughly what that translates to. We see this as we're exploring earlier. We did kind of gloss over it, admittedly, but we keep seeing this word come up, Mithraeum, and nobody knows what it means. But it is provocative, and it's now what we're going to be searching for. It's a piece of Tassing's history, and nobody knows, but it is a room to worship the Roman Mithra.
Yeah.
Andreas says, like, this is probably where the thread puller is hiding. It's the one place I literally cannot get to, even though I have like tried to track them there. So that's where we're off to. We get to take, as we're like exploring the underground, we take control of Andreas. This is an incredibly cool scene.
Ugh, so good.
We take control of him, and as we're walking forward through the dark, we start to see hallucinations of this in the dark. We don't see them; we just see their eyes of all of the people that have died at the hands of Andreas's meddling. The Baron, Act 1 and Act 2 folks, Caspar, if applicable. And as he's suffering these mental delusions, the camera begins to shake and shake and shake. And as you cross over into a room, you are now in your mind palace. This is the third stage of it. It's being wrecked by this like giant, kind of looks like a monstrous version of Andreas or the Baron.
It's like a grinning, it's like half grinning, half grimacing figure of this like fat, like, I don't know, like townsfolk person. Yeah, and he's destroying the mind palace. Yeah.
And Melancholia is there. You know, Andreas is like, am I dreaming? And she says that she'll be gone soon, and the mind palace along with her. She says that Andreas himself must learn to leave it and to live externally in his pain rather than retracting into the safety here. Embracing life comes with embracing pain. You know, that's just simply reality. And Andreas is the only one that can leave this place. And this is where we get the final iteration of his labyrinth. Yeah. So going all the way back to the beginning, we talked about the symmetrical Italian city. You can approach it from all sides. That's when Andreas is in order. Everything is in good spirits. And then the labyrinth is when he's sort of seeking. There's only one path, but it's meditative and solitary, and he's trying to seek out. This labyrinth now represents his mind at its most disarray, partly because, no contact for years, but also the guilt has just been tearing him down for years and years and years. the labyrinth here will shift as you go through it.
Yeah.
Because it is actively trying to protect you. This whole mind palace, even whenever it was in order, is a way for Andreas to retreat into himself, to protect himself from reality, to cloister himself from the feelings that he is avoiding dealing with. This has so many real life implications, and I don't want to share some of them that I can relate to, but this idea that you have to experience, you have to choose to experience life in its fullest, and that does not just mean all of the happy moments. It means the difficult moments too. You cannot retreat in words to yourself. You cannot avoid these feelings through substance, through sheltering yourself away from other people. You have to embrace it all, and we are seeing Andreas struggle with this now.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly important. Obviously, I think that you have a quote, and I'll allow you to go ahead and read that. There is a quote that.
No, you can read it if you'd like.
Okay, it's just the last thing that Beatrice says to Andres, and I teared up at this point because I feel like it's just so many moments in this game are so readily applicable to anybody who has gone through some hard things in their life, who has experienced loss, who has experienced hardship, who has experienced a change in the very nature of who they are. And I think that the last thing that Beatrice says to Andreas as the maze is shifting, and she says, the two things are merging in your mind. There are layers to everything, even our memories. Over time, the foundations become buried. We can no longer recall how we got here or what came before. And that's just so important to understanding who Andreas is at this moment, what he has done, what he hasn't done to come back into reality, to live in the real world. The trauma that he experienced at the end of Act 2 was so insanely desperate. And to answer your question earlier, Rick, I think that Caspar is actually dead. I don't think there's any, I think from what we understand is that Andreas found a way out, but Caspar, because he stayed with Andreas, because you were kind to him, went back for the books that Andreas was so obsessed with.
Oh yeah, and what I was confused about was it Caspar that saved him? Was all.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think I mean I can only imagine that he found some way out, but we're kind of left to our imagination at that point. But more to obviously what we're experiencing here in the labyrinth. There's a couple of pieces that I think are most important, is the fact that his mind has been irrevocably altered by his grief, by his sorrow, and by his obsessive nature with the fact that he didn't want to deal with his life even at the beginning of Act 2. He didn't want to come to terms with what his life had become. He was disillusioned with his art. He was disillusioned with where he wanted to, end up in life, and came back to Tassing looking for answers. And instead of answers, he only found death. And that was so hard for him to grapple with that he became this hermit. He became this shadow of his former self. And it's like Beatrice says, there are layers to everything, even our memories. And he is having so much trouble sifting through it. And it's another reason why, I think that the labyrinth is the investigation is his labyrinth. When you look at the depiction of it, there is no way to get to the center. There is no way to get to the middle. There is a circle with walls around it. And there's this monster that's in the center of it. And there's no way to solve this mystery as him. And it's what she's trying to tell him. And I don't know if I can't remember if she actually says it, that you have to leave. You have to leave this labyrinth. And that's kind of what I think brings him out of it at the end here.
Well, and it's ultimately, this is a hopeful scene too, right? Because he realizes that he takes control, but it comes after these conversations he has with his own psyche to get closure. And this is where I was getting really choked up, because he'll first speak with Sabine, his wife, and he gets some closure there. And then he speaks with Caspar. And if Caspar is dead, he'll say, "It's so good to see you, Master." And he's like, "Why? How could you say that? I let you die." And he says, No, everybody knows that you did the best that you could. Nobody blames you. And this is where he starts saying, I can get out of this. Is my maze. I can get out of here. And that's when August comes up. And the August scene in the last one was heartbreaking enough. But this one, it starts out the same, but August Geez, I'm getting choked up just thinking about it. August will speak to you here, and he says, it's okay, Daddy, I love you. Mm-hmm. And it's just really beautiful. This is him, sort of like he's allowing himself to feel this closure, and he's finally, and it's notable too that Melancholia at some point here transforms back into Beatrice, representing his healing. And he finds his way out of the maze, and he's like, "This is, I can choose to do this. Magdalene needs me. I need to get out of here." It's just an incredible emotional climax to his arc, to see somebody that is so mentally tormented, not quote unquote fix himself, but allow himself to be healed.
Yeah, it's something that I hate to draw comparisons. Because I love both of these games so much, but it's something that I thought that was really reminiscent to a game that I think that we've both played, and that's Disco Elysium.
Oh, sure.
And it's there's a final moment where the main character, Harry Dubois, comes face to face with a very significant character. I'm not here to spoil Disco Elysium, but he comes face to face with his character that is so significant to his past, that's so significant to his trauma and his hardship, that it kind of allows you to be able to move on. And I think that that's something that's so important here. Him seeing the faces of these people from his past, it's about accepting the fact. It's him accepting the fact that he was not perfect. He did not do everything right, but he needs to continue to move on regardless. And I struggle with people criticizing this game, the fact that it takes that Andreas being alive takes away from the tragedy or takes away from the impact of his death in the second act, because without that, you don't get this. And I think this is so important. And again, it's kind of reiterating what I was, trying to argue or posit, that this is one of my favorite this is my favorite act of the game, because it allows so many threads or so many different disparate moments in the history, in the hardship that Andreas had dealt with throughout the course of Pentiment, to kind of come to closure, to kind of get the sense of fruition, and finally, learning a little bit of the real truth of what's behind, the mystery of this game.
I don't agree with the criticism of Andreas being alive, simply because it's not like they're bringing him back. Right. That's my problem in games, is when they kill somebody off and then bring them back to make everybody happy. Here, it was just a matter of perspective. Andreas wasn't dead.
Yeah, he never died.
They didn't. Right. They didn't bring him back I don't want to spoil any games, but JRPGs do this all the time. They were dead. Just kidding. We brought them back. Yeah. And it's that's cowardly. But no, I'm with you. This is beautiful. This all comes back to the passage of time. The wheel of time is ever moving, and even though when it moves, occasionally we are dealt great hardship, it allows us to heal as well.
Yeah. So
as you snap back to reality here, you are in a new room with Sister Amelie, and she's holding this statue head. And this is a new room too, by the way. She's in a sort of religious trance devotion state. And at first, she's saying that this is a spiritual realm, and at first it's maybe, but then Magdalene comes in and you're like, oh no, this is real. Especially after, the Mind Palace. We don't know what's real. We don't know what's up or down, but Magdalene is here. So this is real. Amelie explains that she comes here when the Lord calls her, when she wills it, through the doors of life and death, which she's speaking poetically here. She comes here through the grave, her own grave that she's dug in the church. That's how she's come to this underground Mithraeum, which is what this room is. And she says that she delivers messages to those who the Lord declare. She used to be a scribe. This reveal is so cool. At this moment, immediately, Andreas is like, no. And her font immediately changes.
Yep.
Her font immediately changes to the thread puller. It's her. She's been writing these notes. What? Oh, man. I did not see this coming at all. This was such a cool twist.
It is such a cool twist. And I always suspected Amelie because of the fact that, like, you know that there's like underground Roman ruins. It's very convenient for the mechanics of this game, you know, for there to be some type of ability for people to traverse throughout it. You know that, like, Amelie had been digging her own grave inside of the room that she has been cloistered in for so much time. And then, like, she has no connection seemingly to anybody else. I always found her character to be like highly suspicious even from the beginning of the game. I was like, what's going on with you over here? Just because, like, the fact of like how she is, or like what she represents to this town society, is a mystery in and of itself. So like, I was surprised when this happened, and I was like, oh geez, like, I don't know. But like, it's also like I had no other way to explain it until now, you know, how she was the thread puller.
The scoring throughout this scene is just beautiful too. It's one of my favorite tracks in the game. She, you know, we talked to her and she says, your notes have been hurting people, killing people. Mm-hmm. And she was just under the pretense that she didn't know what she was writing. She just thought that she was doing the Lord's will.
Yeah.
And she begins to break down and spiral and eventually faints because she hears that she had a direct hand in these murders. And it's just then that Father Thomas comes in. And it's explained in a second, but immediately we're just like, it was him. It was him all along.
Yeah.
Who else could it have been? And, you know, he says, he's got a great line. He says, like, you know, on any other occasion, I would be overjoyed to see you, Andreas. In truth, I thank God that you're alive, but I'm afraid that this reunion is not a happy one. He explains Amelie had no idea what she was doing. She was just writing because he told her to. Yeah. He is the thread puller.
Yep.
And we ask why, and he says, well, look around. This Mithraeum that they were in, it depicts St. Moritz and St. Satiia as the Roman god Mars and the Roman goddess Diana. They are the same. When the Romans left this town, Christians that took over co-opted the statues and the myths to their faith. There was no St. Moritz and St. Satiia as they know it. That was Mars. That was Diana.
Mars and Diana, yeah.
Now they are the Christian faith to the townspeoples. And Father Thomas will say, not stories, because, you know, you say, like, who cares if they're just stories? The stories are wrong. And he says, not stories, saints, our saints. The settlers did not see them through the pagan Roman eyes, but through Christian eyes. And it sets up this whole idea. Once, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. Once Father Matthias learned that St. Moritz had never actually come to Tassing, and that the shrine in the meadow the headless shrine in the meadow wasn't St. Moritz, that Chekhov's shrine, Chekhov's statue, it wasn't St. Moritz, it's actually Mars, Father Thomas resolved to deal with it. He poisoned Father Matthias to keep the faith alive. And, you know, Magdalen's like, why would you do this? So what if the townsfolk are wrong? And he says it's not that simple. Without this, the entire faith collapses. And he says, what does it mean for the church that has given people hope, fixed like a false star in a dark sky? If the people have reason to doubt the validity of the saints, can they doubt the church? Can they doubt the gospel, the word of God? This would create a massive crisis of faith that we've seen going back through centuries. It's not just people like Nietzsche that talk about, well, God is dead and we have killed him. It was everybody before him. Blaise Pascal with Pascal's Wager, Søren Kierkegaard, even all the way back to Aristotle, saying that there must be a great mover, and St. Thomas Aquinas picking it up and saying, well, the great mover is God. This crisis of faith has been in history forever. And if this were to come to pass, what would happen? I mean, these people, they might have a meltdown. What I love about Father Thomas as a villain is his motivations. Maybe his methods are too far. Yeah. You know, I'm not saying killing people is good, but his motivations are so understandable if you can put yourself in his position. I can see exactly. He's so believable.
Yeah, I mean, he's a zealot, right? He is a true believer of God and of the Word of God. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about, you know, earlier about the importance of blind faith, and coming from his mouth directly, is that, you know, God has a plan Therefore, there is no reason for hopelessness. And that kind of underscores rather the very reason for like why he's going about it. I don't understand it. I cannot empathize or relate to it. Like I'm looking at the idea of what would happen if the people found out that there is no such thing as Saint Maurice, that there is no such thing as Saint Satya, and that these are instead depictions of Mars and Diana, and it's just Roman mythology. I feel like Father Thomas ran down this like thought path, this logical thought path, and he started it with something that was like, I think it shook his own faith.
Well, that could be true. That could be true. I think we have to kind of displace ourselves out of 2024, out of growing up in a atheist adjacent household, to thinking like these townsfolk built their entire lives and made entire decisions, who to marry, where to live, what occupation to go into. They centered their entire life around God. They have been giving all of their money to the church to the point of almost starvation, not because they wanted to, but because that's the Christian thing to do. And imagining in that situation, learning that it was all for nothing, that you wasted your family's lives and half of yours. If I were in that position, I don't know that I could handle it with a cool head.
I think you're right. I appreciate you contextualizing that a little bit better for me, because it's like I struggle with Father Thomas's motivations here, because like I'm thinking of it from the perspective of they would have found some other way to just continue living their lives. They would have found some logical or illogical loophole just to be like, well, that might be true, but still God is real in some way or another, because I feel like that's what folks of faith do. I feel like they find a way to continue believing regardless of what, truth or what facts of the matter like exist in the present day. And I feel like that, to my point earlier, that Father Thomas's revelation or his understanding and his access to the Mithraeum and realizing that these are just concepts that the Christians lifted from the history of the Roman ruins in this town, that it shook his faith so deeply that he interpreted his own existential dread onto that of the people of Tassing, and then chose to take these actions, right?
Yeah, totally. I don't think that you're wrong at all. I think he was so singularly focused that he, at a certain point, he could have stopped. I think there's an argument to be made in this chapter, in Act 3, where the influence of the church isn't so much as a stranglehold, so much as it is somebody standing next to you, if that makes sense. People are beginning to not speak with the divine greetings, God be with you, and etc. I think in this act especially, they would be much more open to the idea of, okay, well, maybe the saints weren't actually here. That doesn't necessarily mean our faith is invalid. It just means that, our patron saint maybe was from a different religion or belief system.
Right.
In Act 1 or 2, maybe not, but in Act 3, certainly.
Yeah.
So there is no excuse for Father Thomas. Well, he shouldn't have been killing people ever, but there's certainly no excuse for him to be doing his antics here in Act 3. I'm with you on that. Like, the people could have handled this.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, he locked himself in the moment that he poisoned Father Matthias, and there's no turning back on from that point in time. And his using sister Amelie to the extent that he was wrong. And obviously, like her being an accessory to these murders, like that's so hard to deal with, especially for somebody who, at this point obviously is very mentally unstable for, that period of time. Yeah.
And we'll get to see a little bit of the aftermath of this. You ask him, so what are you going to do now that we know? Like, are you gonna kill us too?
Yeah.
And he says no. He doesn't have the desire or the means to kill you, but he will stop anybody from finding the truth of what is down here. He wants to maintain the church's order and not risk a crisis of faith. So he begins to destroy the central pillars that are holding this place up. And Andreas is like, brother, you are going to kill us all. Father, you are going to kill us all. And he says, it may be suicide, but this is an act of faith, and I will justify myself to St. Peter when I get there.
Yeah.
And he's like, look, like, you grab Sister Amelie, you three get out of here, otherwise you're going to die with me. And you do. You take her and you run out, and Father Thomas knocks the beam down. He gets into a praying position, and everything crumbles. He's dead.
Yeah.
Outside, this is like the textbook definition of a Pyrrhic victory. Nothing about the means that they had went to quote unquote win far outweigh this meager victory. It doesn't even feel good, and they both say that. Like, Magdalene will say, "This doesn't, like, we're right, but this doesn't feel good."
Yeah.
And you have a choice. You can tell the people of Tassing the truth, or you can keep it from them. I didn't know that this was a choice. I guess it is. I opted to tell the truth.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, I didn't want to. I wanted the events of this game to mean something. I didn't want to glaze over the truth just for the sake of, I don't know. I don't know why someone would choose to not reveal the truth in this situation, other than just to kind of like, click through the options, and maybe there's an achievement attached to it. I'm not sure, but yeah, I completely went with the truth in this one.
The game ends with a little tag, with a little epilogue. Magdalene is leaving town. She's going to Prague to be with Esther. Now that, Klaus is gone. Oh my gosh, that's something that we completely glossed over. Klaus dies.
Yeah, he dies. Mm-hmm.
Magdalene and Andreas come back right after this to talk to him, and she like holds his hand and she starts telling him what happened, and just in the middle of it, he passes away. It's very unceremonious. It's not theatrical. He just, as she's speaking with him, he passes. Yeah. Before she's able to tell him the truth about everything too. And, Andreas consoles her, but I appreciate that it wasn't turned into this giant spectacle. It just, again, the wheel of time continues to spin forward. It happened. Yeah. And it's devastating to her, and it helps her in her decision to leave town to go to Prague. But yeah, he passes away.
I think that this game, this moment, obviously that's incredibly, poignant moment, especially for Klaus and Magdalene in the context of this act. But I think this game, this is one of the reasons why, if anybody were to ask me, I don't know why they would ask me this question, but like, what do you think is the best game to handle the themes of death or handle death within the narrative of the game itself? I would say Pentiment, without even a second thought. Because like, just like every time someone dies or every time something traumatic happens in this game, it's so abrupt and it's never explained. And it's like so indicative of like, for, our dear listeners out there, if you ever experienced, death adjacent, in your family or whatever the case may be, in my life, it's always felt abrupt. I never got the chance to say goodbye to my grandfather, who died earlier this year, actually in March. And it's like, it feels years ago. It feels like a long time ago, even though it wasn't that long ago. Was it this year? I don't know. But regardless, it's one of those things where you have to find your own way to come to terms with how people move on throughout this life. And I think that that's one of the things that are depicted in this game like so well. It's like they can't handle it. But again, specifically to what Rick said so excellently, is that like the passage of time continues, and that it's painful, but it also kind of gives you the chance to come to terms with it, with how people pass. And that's why this game just does it so well.
In some ways, that abruptness is a blessing. I had the experience of seeing somebody knowing that they would be dead before I saw them again, and it's not an experience I would wish on anybody. Yeah. It's a truly awful thing. I agree with you. This game handles death in a very unique and it's a great depiction of it. Especially since we get to see the town and the new generations take over and show remembrance. It's really good. before Magdalene leaves, she does finish the mural, and as you're leaving town, you go and talk to everybody, say your goodbyes. Oates, Otto's son, this is something we didn't really talk too much about, but throughout Otto's son, Oates is kind of like flirting with Magdalene. It's a will
painfully
they, won't they.
courting her, yeah.
Yes, yeah, everybody in town wants you to be with him. You can choose to either do that or not. If you choose to, he'll come with you. If not, he'll ask one more time, like, "Are you sure?" And you can say no, and he's like, "Well, okay." So that he either comes or goes. But you go and talk to everybody, and you end up leaving town. Andreas stays behind. Everybody is very welcoming of him. They're happy to see him. They give him new clothes, a haircut. It's really great, and she sees him off.
Yeah,
and
he's like a new man. Honestly,
he is. But interestingly, after Magdalene leaves, he turns to to Gret and he says, "I'm lost." And she says, "You're welcome with us anytime. And besides, the kids need an art teacher." And they're drawing up on the windmill. And this closing shot is just brilliant. Mm-hmm. Andreas will go up, and at first, a viewer to this might be aggravated because the camera is behind the windmills, and the windmill blades are going in front of the characters. And you're like, why is the camera here? And it'll show Andreas teaching the little kids to draw. And after a couple passes of the windmill blade, it'll pass, and then everybody's gone, and the drawings are completed. And that represents, again, the passage of time.
Yeah.
It's showing us by the drawings that Andreas helped create the impact that he's had on this town. And this is just another way of leaving behind history. This is what they're leaving. And that's the final scene of this game. The camera pulls back to show that this was all being written in a book. We can infer by Andreas based on, we see the most of his insight. We see the fonts change based on his perspective. It's pretty clearly based on Andreas, I think, and because he was following Magdalene, so he knows that whole story.
Yeah.
The credits roll as we get to see the mural that we created, and the mural will change depending on choices you made in the game and what you decided to depict. For example, if you it'll show all of the depictions that you chose, and then at the end, Magdalene left one section blank for the future. Right. Which I think is really sweet. And that section will show family trees and what happened to people after we left. If you convinced Ursula to get into the occult, for example, she might be depicted burning at the stake. If you didn't indulge Václav in his beliefs, he reforms and turns into a priest. If you convinced Andris, the blacksmith, to go and find his long-lost love in another city, it shows them, and their family tree has 6 kids. So he has a huge family because of you.
Yeah, it's great. And as you're going through these depictions, shout out again to Alchemy in the final track of this game. It's I think pronounced Ein Traum, and it is a piece that seems like it's not necessarily fitting. It's a more modern piece. It's still reminiscent of all of the other instruments and in the different, historical compositions that you've heard in the earlier songs. But it's still, it's nostalgic. It's reminiscent. It's like my favorite track of the game, and it's perfect. It's perfect for the ending of the sequence to kind of do the wrap up to see how everything happened to you at the end there.
Absolutely. And that's Pentiment. I mean, we did it. We got through it. 5 hours roughly, and I think we did this game justice, but there's still so much more that could have been said.
Yeah, I can agree with you. I think we did a great job. And again, I think one of the important things for listeners to think about is I think this is a pretty significant game, and this is a very in-depth and involved game. And if Rick and I were to sit here and talk about every aspect, every moment of all of the different investigations, we'd be here forever. But this is a true work of art. And I'm so glad that I got to cover this with Rick here. And this was a great time, honestly.
Oh, thank you, man. I'm really glad that you decided to join me. This game is really special, and whenever you had said that you loved it as much as I did, I knew that this would be a good one to talk with you about. And so continues you've never been on a game on this show that wasn't directly dealing with either mythology or religion.
Oh, we have a track record set up, so we have to keep going with it now.
It's true. Hades, Xenosaga, and Pentiment.
It's fantastic. I'm always happy to talk about mythology and religion with Rick any day of the week. Hell, maybe we'll do like a Call of Duty Black Ops 6 episode or something like that. Who's to say?
Oh yes, the ethics of war. So I thought about having a little discussion at the end surrounding the themes. I think, just looking partly because we're being pragmatic, looking at the clock, also because I think we spoke at length. I don't really have anything to add on the themes. I feel like I articulated what I needed to throughout. Do you feel the same? Do you have anything that you wanted to add before we close shop here?
No, yeah, agreed with you at the same point. I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself too much. I feel like I covered pretty well, like, my feelings on the themes as we were going throughout it. So yeah, 100%. I think that we can kind of go into closing us out. You
don't want to get into your religious beliefs and exactly how you live your own life?
Do you have another 4 hours for discussion on agnosticism?
Yeah. I'll confuse you. On my shelf, I have the Christian Bible, the Satanic Bible, the Tao Te Ching. There's no way you can read me. No way.
That's right. Yeah. You got to keep him moving. You got to keep him guessing, Rick.
Yeah. You never let him know your next move. So, Pentiment, amazing work. Please check this game out if you have any interest in historical fiction, morality systems in games, murder mysteries. It's just terrific. You can find the sources that I used in the show notes for episodes 1 and 2. They're going to be the same for both. I'm just copy and pasting, I'll be honest, but they'll all be in there. Especially the interview with Josh Sawyer. Definitely check that out. Not interview, talk. Friday Night Gamecast, as we mentioned last time, are doing a lot of great things on their channel. Anything new to report? I know it's been a couple weeks since we recorded part 1. What's new in Friday Night Gamecast?
Well, we are recording ahead. So obviously we've done some work, and I think we have a couple of things ahead of, well, Rick and I are recording this episode ahead of what will already be out at this point in time. But obviously, if folks are interested, I'm a huge Fire Emblem fan. I did a fantastic episode on the infamous Fire Emblem Fates, which is just like a ridiculous entry into the franchise. So that was an incredibly fun talk to get into with Jala from Jala-chan's place on our show there. And then we went in and did the classic goof of not going back and looking close enough at our notes. And we covered retro gaming. We try once a season to cover a period of retro games in the year. And we brought the fantastic Chris Copeline from Retro Hangover Podcast. I know he's a friend of pixelprojectradio as well, and we were on Xenosaga together, and obviously through that work I wanted to bring him in and have a talk with us about Gen 5 gaming. So this is a Ridley Scott's director's cut. This is Gen 5 gaming part 2, the Roadshow edition for Gen 5, the PS1 and N64. But that was a fantastic talk, and as of the date that this is coming out, my hope is that we will have out our review for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth with Colby Moyer from the Pixel Project from the Switch It Up Switch It Up podcast. Yeah, Colby Moyer of the Switch It Up podcast. So I know for a fact that that's going to be amazing. We're actually set to record that pretty soon here, but folks can look out for those on the show.
Very, very cool. Gen 5, 2 of my favorite consoles, the PS1 and the Sega Saturn. Great generation. So folks check out Friday Night Gamecast. It's a great show. Nick hosts that with his co-host Will. Yeah, we don't need to say last names.
No, it's unimportant. Yeah, he's not worried about it. But yeah, Nick, I'm Nick, and Will is always my co-host on the show. And again, thank you, Rick, for having us on. Please go check out our work that we did on Hades if you've enjoyed our discussion here, because that had a lot of conversations about Greek mythology, something that Will has a lot of interest that he studied in depth when he was in school. So that was a great time.
Very, very cool. You can find links to Friday Night Gamecast in the description. Go check out their socials as well as their podcast feed. You can find links to our socials as well. Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky are the main ones, as well as our Discord. Please consider joining the Discord. It is free. You don't have to be a patron to join. And it is a great place to just chat, let off some steam after work, get into discussions, whatever you want to do. We do have a Patreon, as I mentioned as well. You can find a link to that in the show notes. If you want to get some bonuses and support the show, you can do that at www.patreon.com/pixelprojectradio. And lastly, ratings and reviews. I don't have a new one to read this week, but if you would be so kind, please consider leaving a rating and or a review on your podcast app of choice. The ones that I check for reviews personally are, I check an aggregate reviewer now, so you should be good wherever. But, if you leave a review, I'll read it at the very end of a show. It's always a nice way to encourage folks to have their voice heard. And that's all the plugging from me. You can find all of the relevant information in the show notes, sources, links to our stuff, links to Friday Night Game Cast. And I think with that, we can close the episode. So, Nick, again, thank you so much for joining me. And listeners, thank you for sticking around across 5-ish hours of Pentiment. Until next time, I am your host, as always, Rick Firestone, that's my name. And until we see each other again, take care. We're signing off for now.